Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where the quiet edges of the world have a way of telling the most interesting stories. Imagine a thread stretched across a map. A long, thin, unbroken thread running from the cold northern tip of Alaska all the way down to the southern reaches of Patagonia, winding through mountain ranges and desert plains and coastal cities, crossing borders and rivers and time zones, connecting the whole long spine of the Western Hemisphere. 30,000 kilometres, give or take. One of the great engineering achievements of the 20th century. A road system so vast and so continuous that you could, in theory, get into a car somewhere north of Fairbanks and drive south, through Canada, through the United States, through Mexico and Guatemala and Honduras and Costa Rica and Panama, and keep going, all the way down into South America, through Colombia and Ecuador and Peru and Chile, until the road finally runs out of continent. That thread exists. That road is real. It is called the Pan American Highway, and it is one of the longest road systems ever built. And then, somewhere in the jungle between Panama and Colombia, the thread simply stops. Not because of a river that could not be bridged, not because of a mountain range that was too steep to grade, not because the engineers ran out of ideas or the governments ran out of money, though money has certainly been part of the conversation. The thread stops because of a stretch of jungle roughly 106 kilometres wide that has, for decades, resisted every serious attempt to put a road through it. 106 kilometres. In a system of 30,000, that is barely a rounding error on a map. And yet it remains, a gap in the longest road in the world, a place where the pavement ends, the jungle begins, and the logic of the modern world quietly loses its footing. That place is called the Darién Gap. Tonight we are going to spend some time with it. Not rushing through it, not treating it like a curiosity to be explained in 5 minutes and moved on from. The Darién deserves more than that, because the more you look at it, the more you realise that this is not simply a story about a missing road. It is a story about terrain that behaves like something alive, about the people who have lived inside it for centuries, about the colonial expeditions that came in with grand ambitions and left in pieces, about the engineers who ran the numbers and quietly shook their heads, about the hundreds of thousands of people who are crossing it right now, on foot, with almost nothing, because they have decided that what is on the other side is worth whatever the jungle asks of them, and about what it means in a world that has mapped every mountain and paved nearly every valley, that a place like this still exists. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? What does it look like outside your window right now? Is it cold where you are or warm? Is it late? And have you ever looked at a map, really looked at one, and noticed something that did not make sense? A road that ends without explanation. A blank space where you expected to see something filled in. Most of us glide past those moments. We assume there is a reason we do not know about, and we move on. The Darién Gap is what happens when you stop and actually ask why. If this kind of careful, unhurried storytelling is something you enjoy, it would mean a great deal if you took a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you might think, and it lets us keep making these long, slow journeys into the places and questions that do not usually make the headlines. Now, let us settle in. The Darién Gap sits at the narrowest point of the Americas. Geographically, it is the land bridge that connects Central America to South America, a thin strip of terrain in what is now southeastern Panama and the northwestern corner of Colombia. On a globe, it looks almost trivial. A pinch point. The kind of place you might draw with a single pencil stroke. But the satellite images tell a different story. Where the rest of the isthmus shows roads and towns and the pale geometry of cleared land, the Darién is just green. An unbroken, dense, almost aggressive green that swallows everything beneath it. The name itself has been around for centuries. The Spanish called this region Darién when they arrived in the early 1500s, and the name has stuck through every administration, every border redrawing, every attempt to impose some kind of order on a landscape that has never been particularly interested in order. Today, Darién is both the name of a province in Panama and the informal name for the entire gap region that straddles the border. When people say the Darién Gap, they're usually referring to a corridor roughly 160 kilometers long and between 50 and 80 kilometers wide, depending on how you measure it. That sits between the last paved road in Panama and the first paved road in Colombia. And here is the thing that surprises a lot of people when they first learn about this place. It is not empty. It is not some vast, uninhabited wilderness sitting untouched between two countries. People live there. Indigenous communities have been living there for centuries, longer than Panama and Colombia have existed as countries. There are villages along the river systems. There are children growing up there. There are markets and traditions and daily routines that have nothing to do with the question of whether a road should or should not be built through the jungle. The Darién is not a void. It is a place. A complicated, layered, inhabited place that happens to be extraordinarily difficult for outsiders to move through. The Pan American Highway, for its part, ends at a town called Yavisa on the Panamanian side. Yavisa is a small river town, dusty and humid, sitting at the edge of Darién province where the road simply terminates. There is a bridge there, and then the pavement stops, and beyond it the jungle takes over. On the Colombian side, the highway picks up again near the city of Turbo, in the Urubá region of Antioquia. Between those 2 points, there is no road. There is no bridge across the Atrato River. There is no graded path, no railway, no tunnel. There is jungle and swamp and mountain and river and more jungle. The paradox of the Darién is that it is simultaneously one of the most discussed gaps in global infrastructure and one of the least understood. People know the name. They know there is a missing piece of the Pan American Highway. But the reasons why that piece is missing are layered in a way that takes some time to unpick. It is not one problem. It is a dozen problems sitting on top of each other, each one making the others worse, each one reinforcing the conclusion that this particular stretch of land is not ready to be crossed by a paved road, and possibly never will be. Some of those problems are geological. The Darién is not just a jungle. It is a jungle sitting on top of some of the most difficult terrain on the continent, with rainfall figures that would make a civil engineer quietly set down their coffee and stare out the window for a while. Some areas of the Darién receive more than 3,000 millimeters of rain per year, and the soil beneath all that water is largely clay, dense and heavy, and almost completely unable to drain. Building a road on that kind of ground is not simply difficult. It is the kind of engineering challenge that tends to produce feasibility studies full of carefully worded sentences that mean, essentially, we're not sure this is worth attempting. Some of the problems are ecological. The Darién is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is one of the most biodiverse regions in the Western Hemisphere, and it also functions, quite accidentally, as a biological firewall between two continents, preventing certain livestock diseases from moving north from South America into Central America and beyond. Closing the gap with a road would open a corridor that has been closed for a very long time, and the consequences of that are not entirely predictable. Some of the problems are political, and some of them are human in the most direct sense, involving the people who use the gap's darkness and difficulty as cover for things that governments would rather not discuss in detail. And some of the problems are simply physical. The Darién is hard. It is hot and wet and disorienting and alive in ways that make sustained human movement through it enormously difficult. The people who have crossed it on purpose as expeditions have taken months to cover distances that a car could handle in 2 hours on a decent road. The people who are crossing it right now, out of desperation, are doing so at serious risk to their lives. All of that is what we are going to explore tonight, slowly, in the way this place deserves. But before we get into the history of failed crossings, before we talk about the engineering surveys and the ecological debates and the human cost of what is happening in that jungle right now, we need to start at the beginning. We need to understand what the Darién actually is, not as an abstraction, not as a gap on a map, but as a physical place, with specific terrain and specific weather, and specific reasons why it behaves the way it does. Because the Darién is not difficult by accident, it is difficult by nature. And the nature of it is worth understanding in some detail, because once you see what the land actually looks like, a lot of the rest of the story starts to make a particular kind of sense. So let us start with the land itself. If you were to look at the Darién on a satellite map, the first thing you would notice is the colour. It is green in the way that very few places on Earth are still green, a deep, layered, almost bruised shade of green that tells you immediately that whatever is growing down there is growing with serious intent. There are no clean edges, no tidy boundaries between one kind of terrain and another. It is just green, pressing in from every direction, broken occasionally by the silver threads of rivers and the darker shadows of ridgelines where the forest climbs up into the clouds. That green is doing a lot of work. It is covering a landscape that is, underneath all that vegetation, extraordinarily varied and extraordinarily difficult. The Darién is not simply a flat jungle. It is a combination of terrain types that happen to sit right next to each other in ways that make movement through them particularly unpleasant, and in some cases genuinely dangerous. Running roughly along the border between Panama and Colombia is the Serranía del Darién, a mountain range that does not get as much attention as it probably deserves in discussions about why this region is so hard to cross. These are not enormous mountains by global standards. The highest peak sits somewhere around 2,000 metres. But height is not really the point here. The point is that these ridgelines are steep and densely forested, with slopes that collect rainfall the way a bathtub collects water, and they create a series of natural walls that any overland route would need to either climb over or find a way around. Neither option is straightforward. To the west of those mountains, the terrain drops down into the basin of the Atrato River, which is one of the more remarkable rivers in the Western Hemisphere, and one of the more significant obstacles in the Darién. The Atrato drains an enormous area of northwestern Colombia, and it does so with considerable enthusiasm. It is one of the rivers in the world with the highest volume of water discharge per unit of watershed area, which is a technical way of saying that an extraordinary amount of water moves through it at almost all times. The river itself is wide and slow and brown, flanked by floodplains that expand dramatically during the wet season, turning large sections of the surrounding lowlands into something that is neither quite river nor quite land, but some uncomfortable combination of both. Those lowland areas have a name in the local geography: ciénagas. The word refers to swampy, seasonally flooded wetlands, and the Darién has them in abundance. During the wet season, which runs roughly from April through December, these areas can be almost entirely submerged, with water levels rising fast enough that a campsite that was dry in the morning can be ankle-deep by afternoon. Even during the dry season, the ciénagas do not fully drain. The clay soil beneath them holds water the way a sponge holds water, slowly releasing it over weeks, which means that even in the driest months, much of the lowland terrain in the Darién is waterlogged, unstable, and prone to swallowing things that try to sit on top of it. Roads, vehicles, boots, the ambitions of civil engineers, and then there is the rainfall itself, which deserves its own moment of attention. Some parts of the Darién receive over 3,000 millimetres of rain per year. To put that in some context, London receives about 600 millimetres annually. Seattle, which most people think of as a rainy city, gets around 900. 3,000 millimetres is not just a lot of rain. It is a sustained structural feature of the environment, the kind of rainfall that shapes everything around it: the soil, the vegetation, the river behaviour, the rate at which any human-made structure begins to deteriorate. In the Darién, the rain does not simply fall on the landscape, it saturates it year after year until the landscape itself becomes an expression of all that water. The soil that results from this is largely clay-heavy and poorly drained. Clay soil has a particular relationship with water that makes it a nightmare for road construction. When it is wet, it becomes plastic and unstable, shifting under load and refusing to compact properly. When it dries out, which in the Darién is a relative term, it can crack and shrink in ways that damage any surface laid on top of it. Road building on clay soil requires extensive drainage infrastructure, deep foundations, and constant maintenance. In a place where the rain arrives reliably and in enormous quantity for 8 or 9 months of the year, that maintenance burden becomes essentially continuous. You would not be building a road through the Darién so much as rebuilding it, over and over again, for as long as you intended to keep it open. The wet season and the dry season are worth describing separately, because people sometimes assume that the dry season would make the Darién passable in a way the wet season does not. The dry season, which runs from roughly January through March, does bring a reduction in rainfall and some lowering of river levels. The forest becomes slightly easier to move through in certain areas. Some of the cienagas partially drain. But the dry season in the Darién is not a window of easy passage. It is more like a brief pause in the difficulty. The clay soil remains wet beneath its surface. The rivers are still running fast and wide. The forest is still dense. And the dry season is short enough that any infrastructure project would need to accomplish in 3 months what would normally require a full year of construction time before the rains returned and began undoing whatever had been built. There's also the forest itself to consider, and the forest here is not a simple thing. The Darién contains what ecologists call triple canopy rainforest, which means that the vegetation grows in 3 distinct layers stacked on top of each other. At the top, the emergent trees, some of them reaching 40 or 50 meters in height, form a broken ceiling of leaves and branches that intercepts most of the sunlight before it can reach the ground. Below that is the main canopy, a dense continuous layer of trees and vines and epiphytes, plants that grow on other plants that creates a second ceiling. And below that is the understory, the shadowy lower layer of smaller trees, shrubs, and ground-level vegetation that fills in whatever gaps remain. Walking through triple canopy forest is a particular kind of experience. It is dim even in the middle of the day. Sound behaves differently inside it, absorbed by the vegetation. Your sense of direction becomes unreliable very quickly because you cannot see the sky, cannot see the sun, cannot use the horizon as a reference point. You are navigating by feel and by instinct in a space that looks largely the same in every direction. And the forest is alive in the fullest sense of the word. The Darién has been identified as one of the most biodiverse regions in the entire Western Hemisphere. Over 500 bird species have been recorded here. The mammal list includes jaguars, pumas, tapirs, giant anteaters, and several species of deer. The river systems support caimans and river dolphins. The insect life is essentially uncountable and includes species that are still being formally identified and catalogued by researchers. There are plant species in the Darién that have not yet been given scientific names. The place is, from a biological standpoint, extraordinarily rich and extraordinarily complex. That richness is also part of what makes it so resistant to human infrastructure. A biodiverse ecosystem is a dynamic one, constantly growing, constantly competing, constantly filling in any available space. In a less diverse environment, a cleared strip of land might stay relatively clear for a while. In the Darién, vegetation reclaims disturbed ground with remarkable speed. A path cut through the forest can be visibly overgrown within weeks during the wet season. The forest does not wait to be invited back. It simply returns persistently and without any particular concern for what was there before it. There are also the rivers. The Tuira River, which is the largest river system on the Panamanian side of the Darién, drains a large portion of the province and is navigable by small boat for significant stretches. But navigable and crossable are 2 different things. The Tuira and its tributaries are not stable, predictable waterways. They shift course during heavy rainfall. They flood their banks quickly and without much warning. Crossing them on foot requires either a bridge, a boat, or a willingness to wade through fast-moving water that may be considerably deeper than it appears from the bank. There are places along the migrant route through the Darién where river crossings have killed people, not because the rivers are unusually fierce by global standards, but because people are crossing them exhausted, sometimes at night, without proper equipment, after days of walking through difficult terrain. The rivers are not malicious, they are simply indifferent, which in practice amounts to the same thing. What you end up with, when you put all of this together, is a place that is not simply difficult in one way or two ways, but difficult in a dozen overlapping ways that reinforce each other. The terrain is varied and steep in some places, waterlogged and unstable in others. The rainfall is enormous and sustained. The soil cannot support heavy infrastructure without extensive and continuous intervention. The rivers are wide and unpredictable. The forest grows back faster than it can be cleared. The dry season is too short to work with, and the wet season is too long to work against. And all of this is happening in a climate that is hot, humid, and hard on both equipment and human bodies. Engineers who have studied the Darién in detail tend to describe it not as an impossible place, but as a place where the cost of doing anything scales up very quickly. You can build in the Darién. It is not physically impossible. But every step you take toward making it more accessible costs more than the equivalent step would cost almost anywhere else, and the maintenance costs that follow construction are not a one-time problem, but a permanent feature of the situation. The jungle does not accept a road and then leave it alone. It regards a road as something to be absorbed, slowly and methodically, back into itself. There is something almost clarifying about understanding the physical geography of the Darién before anything else. Because when you know what the land actually looks like, when you have some sense of what the soil is doing, what the rain is doing, what the forest is doing, the rest of the story about why this gap exists and why it has persisted for so long begins to feel less like a series of political failures or engineering shortcomings, and more like a reasonable response to an unreasonable set of conditions. The Darién is not a problem that has not been solved because no one has tried hard enough. It is a problem that has resisted solution because the problem itself is embedded in the nature of the place, in its geology and its hydrology and its ecology, in the basic physical facts of what this land is and how it behaves. And that is before we even begin to talk about the people. Because the Darién is not just a landscape. It is a landscape with inhabitants, communities that have lived here for centuries, that have developed their own ways of moving through this terrain, and their own understanding of what the forest will and will not allow. They have not conquered the Darién. They have not built roads through it or bridged its rivers with concrete. They have done something arguably more impressive, which is to learn how to live inside it, on its own terms, following the logic of the rivers and the seasons rather than trying to impose a different logic from outside. And understanding who those people are and how they navigate what outsiders find almost impossible to cross is the next part of this story. The Mber people have lived in the Darién for a very long time. Estimates vary depending on how you trace migration patterns and oral histories, but their presence in the region is documented back several centuries, and their cultural relationship with the forest goes considerably deeper than that. They are not a small or marginal community. The Embera and their close cultural relatives, the Wunan, have settlements throughout the Darién province on the Panamanian side and into the adjacent Choco region of Colombia. They build their villages along rivers, which is not a coincidence or a matter of preference so much as a recognition of how the land actually works. In the Darién, the rivers are the roads, they always have been. The primary vessel of the Embera is a dugout canoe called a piragua. These are not decorative objects or cultural relics. They are working watercraft carved from single large tree trunks, shaped over time through a process that requires considerable skill and an intimate knowledge of which wood will hold up in fast-moving water and which will not. A well-made piragua is narrow, low to the water, and remarkably stable in the hands of someone who knows how to use it. The Embera move along river systems the way people in other parts of the world use roads, travelling between villages, carrying goods, visiting family, navigating the landscape efficiently and with a degree of ease that would be completely invisible to an outsider watching from the riverbank. What looks from the outside like a chaotic tangle of waterways is, to someone who has grown up in the Darién, a legible network with its own logic and its own rhythms. That knowledge of rhythm is important. The Embera understand the seasonal behaviour of the rivers in a way that takes years to develop and cannot really be transferred through a map or a written description. They know which stretches of river are navigable in the dry season but dangerous in the wet, which tributaries flood quickly after heavy rain upstream, which bends in the river tend to produce strong currents, and which are calm. They know the forest in a similar way, reading signs in vegetation, animal behaviour, and soil condition that indicate where the ground is firm enough to walk on and where it will give way under weight. This is not mystical knowledge. It is accumulated practical knowledge, the kind that develops when a community lives in close relationship with a specific environment over many generations. It is also, frankly, the kind of knowledge that no engineering survey, however thorough, can fully replicate. The Guna people, sometimes spelled Kuna, and formerly known by that name in most international literature, occupy a somewhat different part of the region. The Gunayala Comarca, which is an autonomous indigenous territory on the Caribbean coast of Panama, stretches along the coastline and includes a chain of small islands called the San Blas Islands. The Guna have a strong maritime tradition alongside their forest knowledge, and their political organisation is notably sophisticated. The Guna nation has its own legislature, the Guna General Congress, and has successfully defended its territorial autonomy through both political negotiation and, historically, armed resistance. In 1925, the Guna staged a revolt against Panamanian government attempts to suppress their culture and impose outside administrative control. The revolt, sometimes called the Tule Revolution, resulted in a treaty that recognised a significant degree of Guna self-governance. That autonomy has been maintained and expanded since then, and the Gunayala Comarca today is one of the more clearly defined examples of indigenous territorial rights in Central America. What this means in practical terms is that any serious discussion about infrastructure in the Darién runs directly into the question of indigenous territorial rights. The Embera, Wunan, and Guna communities hold legal claims to significant portions of the land that any road or rail corridor would need to cross. This is not a minor bureaucratic detail. It is a fundamental political and legal reality that has complicated every serious proposal to develop the region. Some of the opposition from these communities to outside infrastructure is rooted in past experience, specifically in the experience of watching outside development projects arrive with promises and depart leaving disruption, environmental damage, and communities worse off than before. That experience is not hypothetical. It is documented across Latin America in a pattern that repeats with enough consistency to make indigenous skepticism of large infrastructure projects entirely reasonable. There is also a more immediate practical dimension to how indigenous communities relate to the Darién's difficulty. Even among the Embera and Wunan, who know this landscape better than anyone, there are places that are considered dangerous, places that experienced community members will not go without careful preparation, and places that are avoided entirely. Some of this is expressed in cultural or spiritual terms, as areas associated with particular dangers or prohibitions. Some of it is simply practical. There are zones within the Darién where even experienced local navigators acknowledge that the terrain becomes genuinely hazardous, where the flooding is unpredictable enough that river travel becomes risky, where the forest becomes so dense that overland movement is effectively impossible without tools to clear a path. The people who know this land best are not under the impression that it is easy. They have simply learned, over generations, where its limits are and how to work within them rather than against them. One thing that often gets lost in outside discussions of the Darién is the sheer ordinariness of daily life in these communities. There are schools in Embera villages, there are health clinics, some of them very basic but present. There are community leaders who deal with the same kinds of administrative concerns that local officials deal with anywhere, managing resources, resolving disputes, maintaining relationships with national governments. Children grow up, learn to paddle piraguas, go to school along the river, and develop their own relationship with the forest and water that surrounds them. The Darién is not a void between two more important places. For the people who live there, it is simply home, with all the texture and complexity that word implies. The Choco-linguistic family, which includes the Embera and Wunan languages, extends across a large geographic area from Panama into northwestern Colombia. This means that the cultural and linguistic community of these peoples does not respect the national border that cuts through the Darién. Embera communities exist on both the Panamanian and Colombian sides of the frontier, and historically there has been movement and connection across that border that national governments have had limited ability to control or even fully observe. This cross-border dimension adds another layer of complexity to any discussion of the region, because the Darién is not simply a geographic barrier between two countries. It is also a space that indigenous communities have always understood as their own territory, existing somewhat separately from the national frameworks imposed around them. The relationship between these communities and the migrants who now cross the Darién in large numbers is complicated and worth acknowledging carefully. In Bajo Chiquito, one of the first Panamanian communities that migrants reach after crossing the jungle, the local Embera population has found itself at the centre of a humanitarian situation that arrived largely without warning and has not been adequately supported by outside institutions. Community members have provided water and basic assistance to exhausted, sometimes injured migrants arriving from the forest. They have also, understandably, expressed concern about the strain this places on local resources and about the security implications of large numbers of strangers moving through their territory. The Embera of Bajo Chiquito did not ask to become a reception point for one of the world's most difficult migration routes. They have managed it with a degree of pragmatism and often generosity that deserves more acknowledgement than it typically receives. It is also worth being direct about something that sometimes gets softened in discussions of indigenous knowledge and the Darién. The fact that Embera and Wunan communities have lived successfully in this environment for centuries does not mean they move through it effortlessly or without risk. Their knowledge of the forest is real and deep, but it operates within the constraints of what the forest actually is. They navigate the Darién by working with its logic, using the rivers where the rivers are usable, avoiding the most dangerous terrain during the most dangerous seasons, and accepting that certain parts of the landscape are simply not meant to be crossed in certain ways. This is not a limitation of their knowledge, it is an expression of it. The most sophisticated understanding of the Darién is the understanding that there are things you do not try to force it to do. That lesson has not always been absorbed by outsiders who have tended to arrive with the assumption that sufficient technology, capital, or determination can overcome what the landscape presents. The history of those encounters is, as we will see, not particularly encouraging. But before we get to the history of failed crossings and collapsed ambitions, it is worth sitting with what the indigenous presence in the Darién actually tells us about the place. These communities are not evidence that the Darién is crossable in the way outsiders imagine. They are evidence of something different, which is that the Darién can be inhabited, can be navigated, can be lived in by people who approach it on its own terms and who have invested generations in learning what those terms are. There is something in that distinction that matters for understanding everything that comes later in this story. The Embera do not cross the Darién in the sense that outsiders mean when they use that phrase. They do not travel overland from the Colombian border to the Panamanian interior in a straight line, pushing through the forest with determination and a compass. They move along the rivers, with the rivers, according to the seasons and the water levels and the particular knowledge of where each stretch of water goes and what it does at different times of year. Their mobility is real, but it follows the grain of the landscape rather than cutting across it. And the landscape's grain, as we have already seen, does not run in a straight line from south to north. It runs in curves, along riverbeds, through valleys, around mountain ridges, following the logic of water and gravity, rather than the logic of a map drawn in an office somewhere far away. That gap between the map's logic and the landscape's logic is, in many ways, the central problem of the Darién. It has been the central problem since the first outsiders arrived and looked at this stretch of land and decided it needed to be crossed, controlled, or connected. And those outsiders began arriving a very long time ago, with very large ambitions and, as it turned out, very incomplete understandings of what they were walking into. The history of outside attempts to move through or settle the Darién is a history of ambition meeting reality in a particularly unforgiving environment, and it stretches back to the early 16th century, when Spanish explorers first pushed into this part of the world and discovered that the jungle had its own opinion about their plans. The Spanish arrived on the Caribbean coast of what is now Panama in the early 16th century, already convinced of their own capability. They had crossed an ocean. They had established footholds in the Caribbean islands. They carried weapons, navigational tools, and an institutional confidence that the world could be mapped, claimed, and organised according to their purposes. The Darién was simply the next thing to be dealt with. That confidence did not survive long contact with the jungle. Vasco Núñez de Balboa is the name most associated with the first documented crossing of the Darién by a European expedition. In September of 1513, Balboa led a party of roughly 190 Spaniards and somewhere between 600 and 1,000 indigenous people, some of them guides, many of them forced labourers, from the Caribbean coast toward the Pacific. The crossing took approximately 25 days. 25 days to cover a distance that, on a modern map, looks like something you could drive in under 2 hours if a road existed. The route was not a straight line. It could not be. The terrain forced the expedition along river valleys, up and over ridges, through swamp and forest and elevation changes that the Spaniards had no frame of reference for. Balboa's journals and the accounts written by his contemporaries describe the journey in terms that make clear how close to failure it came on multiple occasions. Men fell ill. The heat was described as almost incomprehensible to people from a European climate. The forest closed around the expedition in a way that made navigation genuinely difficult, even with indigenous guides who knew the region. Balboa eventually reached a peak from which he could see the Pacific Ocean, a moment that has been romanticised considerably in the centuries since, and then descended to the coast to claim that ocean for the Spanish crown, which is the kind of gesture that makes more sense as theatre than as practical geography. But the crossing itself, the actual movement through the Darién, was brutal and slow, and accomplished only through the labour and knowledge of people who were not there by choice. Without the indigenous guides and the forced workers, the expedition would not have made it. That is not a footnote. It is the central fact of how the crossing happened. And even so, having crossed it once did not mean the Spanish understood what they had crossed. The Darién continued to resist colonial ambitions in the decades that followed. Spanish settlements established in the region struggled with disease, with the difficulty of resupply, and with the persistent hostility of indigenous communities who had no interest in being incorporated into a colonial system. The jungle did not become more manageable because Europeans had now been through it. It remained what it was. The Spanish eventually established a colonial presence in the region, but it was always a contested, difficult, expensive presence. Nothing like the relatively stable colonial infrastructure they built in drier, more accessible parts of the Americas. The most dramatic illustration of what the Darién could do to outside ambitions came not from Spain, but from Scotland, nearly 2 centuries after Balboa's crossing. The Darién scheme, as it is known in Scottish history, is one of those episodes that sounds almost too catastrophic to be real when you first encounter it, and yet the documentation is thorough, and the consequences were genuinely enormous. In the late 1690s, Scotland was an independent kingdom, not yet unified with England, and it was struggling economically. English trade policies effectively excluded Scottish merchants from the most profitable colonial markets, and Scottish entrepreneurs were looking for a way to establish their own overseas trading presence. A man named William Paterson, who had earlier helped found the Bank of England, which is its own interesting irony, proposed that Scotland establish a colony on the Darién Isthmus. The logic was appealing on paper. The isthmus was the narrowest point between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. A Scottish colony there could become a trading hub connecting both sides of the world. Goods could be transported overland across the isthmus rather than making the long and dangerous voyage around Cape Horn. Scotland would become, in Paterson's vision, the commercial crossroads of the globe. The Scottish public invested in this scheme with remarkable enthusiasm. Estimates suggest that somewhere between a quarter and a half of all the liquid capital in Scotland at the time was poured into the Company of Scotland that Paterson established. Ordinary people, not just wealthy merchants, put their savings into it. The emotional investment was enormous. The practical preparation was considerably less thorough. 5 ships carrying roughly 1,200 settlers left Scotland in July of 1698. They arrived at the Darién coast in November and established a settlement they called New Caledonia, with a fort named St. Andrew. What followed was a disaster of almost systematic completeness. The settlers had brought trade goods that were largely useless in the local context, woolen blankets for instance, in a tropical environment where temperatures rarely dropped below what a Scottish summer might consider warm. They had little agricultural knowledge suited to tropical conditions. They had not adequately planned for food supply. The Spanish, who considered the Darién their territory, were hostile. The English colonies in the Caribbean, under instruction from the English crown, refused to provide any assistance, and the Darién itself delivered everything it always delivers to people who arrive without adequate understanding of what it is: disease, heat, flooding, and a forest that provided no easy path to anything. Within months, the mortality rate was devastating. Settlers were dying of dysentery, fever, and malnutrition at a rate that the colony could not sustain. By June of 1699, the surviving settlers abandoned New Caledonia and sailed away. A second expedition arrived shortly after, not yet knowing that the first had already left. This second group of roughly 1,300 people found the abandoned settlement, tried to rebuild it, and faced a Spanish military siege in addition to all the environmental pressures the first expedition had already encountered. By April of 1700, the colony was finished. The total death toll from the 2 expeditions is estimated at around 2,000 people. The financial losses were catastrophic for Scotland. The failure of the Darién scheme is widely cited as one of the factors that made Scottish political union with England in 1707 feel economically necessary, since Scotland needed access to English financial resources to recover from the collapse. One jungle, one stretch of land that covers roughly the area of a mid-sized county in England, had effectively altered the political trajectory of a nation. It is worth pausing on that for a moment. The Darién did not do this with any particular malice. It simply was what it was. The forest flooded when it flooded. The mosquitoes carried what they carried. The soil grew what it grew and refused to grow what it did not. The Spanish were hostile because colonial politics made them hostile. The Darién's role in all of this was essentially passive. It was simply a place that did not accommodate people who arrived without the right knowledge, the right preparation, or the right relationship to what the environment actually demanded. The Scottish settlers had none of these things, and the Darién was not interested in making exceptions. The centuries that followed brought other attempts, other surveys, other moments when outsiders looked at the gap and decided it needed to be solved. By the early 20th century, the ambition had shifted from colonization to infrastructure. The question was no longer how to settle the Darién, but how to build a road through it. The United States, which had taken a significant interest in the Panama Canal and the broader Central American Isthmus, commissioned several surveys of the Darién region in the early and mid-20th century. These surveys were conducted by engineers and geographers who were, by any reasonable standard, highly competent. They had modern instruments, aerial photography by the mid-century period, and access to geological data that Balboa and the Scottish settlers could never have imagined. Their conclusions, reached through careful professional analysis, were not encouraging. The terrain presented problems that did not yield to standard road-building approaches. The soil in the lowland areas, those waterlogged clay-heavy cienagas that drain so poorly and hold water for so long, was not a foundation that could support a paved road without extraordinary and expensive engineering interventions. The rivers were not simply obstacles to be bridged. The Atrato River in particular, which drains an enormous watershed and carries one of the highest water volumes of any river in the Western Hemisphere relative to its size, was a bridging challenge that would have required a major engineering project on its own. And then there was the question of what happened to any road surface during the rainy season, when rainfall in some areas of the Darién exceeds 3,000 millimeters a year, and the ground becomes something closer to a slow-moving liquid than a stable substrate. Engineers noted that even if a road could be built during a dry season, maintaining it through the wet season would require continuous intervention at a cost that was difficult to calculate in advance and almost certainly very high. In 1960, the Pan American Highway Congress, the international body that had been coordinating the development of the highway system across the Americas since the 1930s, passed a resolution affirming that the gap in the Darién would eventually be closed and the highway completed. This was stated as a goal, a commitment, something that would happen in the foreseeable future. It had the quality of an official declaration that assumes the hard part is mostly political will and funding rather than the fundamental nature of the terrain. The resolution has not been fulfilled. More than 6 decades later, the gap is still there. The highway still stops at the jungle's edge on both sides, the Colombian end and the Panamanian end, and the jungle continues to occupy the space between them without any particular concern for what the 1960 Pan American Highway Congress decided. There is something almost quietly comic about that, if you're in the mood to notice it. An international body of road planners formally resolved that a jungle would be crossed, and the jungle did not adjust its behaviour accordingly. But it is also worth taking seriously what that gap between resolution and reality represents. The people who made that declaration in 1960 were not fools. They were engineers and planners and government officials who had successfully built infrastructure across genuinely difficult terrain in other parts of the Americas. They had reasons to believe the Darién could be managed. They had survey data and cost projections and engineering proposals. What they perhaps underestimated was the way the Darién's difficulties compound each other, the way the terrain and the rainfall and the soil and the disease environment and the political complexity of the region all interact to create something that is harder than the sum of its parts. Each individual problem might be solvable in isolation. Together they form something that has so far resisted every serious attempt to overcome it. The early 20th century surveys also documented something that more recent analysis has confirmed. There is no obviously good route through the Darién. Every path from south to north through the gap encounters serious obstacles. Routes that avoid the worst of the swampland tend to go through higher terrain with its own problems, steep gradients, unstable slopes, and the kind of elevation changes that make road maintenance a constant battle against erosion. Routes that follow the river valleys more closely stay lower, but encounter the flooding and soil instability that the lowlands always present. By the time the 1971 to 1975 joint survey by the United States and Panama produced its detailed feasibility study, engineers had identified 3 possible routes through the gap, and the study was candid about the problems with all of them. The cost estimates range from $147 million to over $400 million in 1970s money, which translates to figures considerably higher in current terms, and those estimates were for construction only. They did not fully account for the ongoing cost of maintaining a road in an environment that would work continuously to reclaim it. What the colonial period and the early modern surveys share, across all their differences in technology and intention and scale, is a fundamental encounter with the same basic fact. The Darién is not a place that yields to ambition, regardless of how well organised or well funded that ambition is. Balboa crossed it in 1513 with hundreds of indigenous guides and labourers, and nearly did not make it. The Scottish settlers arrived with capital and hope, and were destroyed within 2 years. 20th century engineers with aerial surveys and modern equipment concluded that a road was theoretically possible but practically nightmarish. Each encounter with the Darién has added another layer to the same lesson, which is that this is a place with its own terms, and those terms are not negotiable. The forest does not care about the Pan American Highway Congress. The rain does not care about cost estimates. The clay soil does not soften because a road needs to be built on it, and yet the attempts have continued, in different forms and with different tools, right up to the present. Because the pressure to close the gap has never entirely gone away, it has only changed shape, taken on new urgency, found new reasons to reassert itself. The engineering challenges that the early surveys documented are still there, still real, still waiting for anyone who arrives with a plan to solve them. But by the time serious modern engineering attention turned back to the Darién, there were additional layers of complexity that the 1960 resolution had not anticipated. The environmental arguments, the political security dimensions, and a humanitarian crisis that no one in 1960 could have predicted had all been added to the pile. The story of why the gap has never been closed is a story that keeps acquiring new chapters, and the engineering chapter, with all its specificity and its sobering arithmetic, is where we need to spend some time next. The Pan American Highway is one of the great infrastructure achievements of the 20th century, and it is worth pausing for a moment to appreciate what that actually means before we get into why one section of it has never been finished. The highway was not planned as a single project. It grew over decades, piece by piece, through negotiation and funding agreements and engineering work that spanned more than a dozen countries and some extraordinarily varied terrain. It crosses deserts in northern Mexico and Chile. It climbs through the Andes at altitudes where the air is thin enough to make construction workers dizzy. It passes through rainforests in Central America, over river deltas, through mountain passes, along coastlines. The total length of the highway system, depending on how you count the various branches and alternate routes, is somewhere in the range of 30,000 kilometres. The section that has never been completed is approximately 106 kilometres long. That is the Darién Gap. Not a missing ocean crossing, not a missing mountain range, not a missing continent. Just 106 kilometres of jungle that has, for nearly a century of serious effort, refused to become a road. The formal history of the highway begins in the 1920s, when the idea of a continuous road connecting North and South America was first proposed at an international conference. The concept was appealing in the way that large, clean ideas often are: a single road, a single connected system, linking the entire Western Hemisphere by land. The Pan American Highway Congress began coordinating the project in the 1930s, and by the 1950s, most of the highway was in place. The route through Mexico, through Central America, through Colombia, and down into South America had been surveyed, funded, and largely built. The Darién section was always the difficult one. It was set aside, deferred, treated as the problem that would be solved after the easier sections were done. By the time the easier sections were done, it had become clear that the Darién was not simply a harder version of the same problem. It was a different kind of problem entirely. The 1971 to 1975 joint survey conducted by the United States and Panama was the most serious and detailed engineering assessment of the gap that had ever been done. It was funded by the US Department of Transportation and the Panamanian government, and it involved aerial surveys, soil sampling, hydrological analysis, and the work of engineers who spent real time in the field, walking the terrain and documenting what they found. The result was a feasibility study that ran to thousands of pages and was candid, in the way that good engineering documents tend to be, about exactly how bad the situation was. The study identified 3 possible routes through the gap. The first followed a more westerly path closer to the Pacific coast, through terrain that was somewhat less flooded but more mountainous. The second took a more central line through the heart of the Darién, which meant confronting the worst of the swampland and the river crossings, but offered slightly shorter overall distance. The third route hugged closer to the Caribbean side, which brought its own problems with elevation changes and rainfall patterns. The engineers were not optimistic about any of them. Each route had sections where the soil conditions were so poor that standard road building techniques would not work. Each route crossed rivers that were, by any measure, serious engineering challenges, and each route passed through terrain where the annual rainfall made the concept of a stable road surface something closer to a theoretical aspiration than a practical guarantee. The cost estimates produced by the study range from approximately $147 million to over $400 million in 1970s currency. To put that in some context, $147 million in 1975 is roughly equivalent to $800 million or more today, and the higher end of the estimate pushes considerably beyond $1 billion in current terms, and these were construction costs. The study was careful to note that maintenance costs in the Darién environment would be ongoing and substantial, but it did not attempt to project them fully, partly because the honest answer was that no one really knew how much it would cost to keep a road open in a place that received this much rain and had this kind of soil. The specific engineering obstacles the study documented are worth going through carefully, because they help explain why the numbers are so high and why the problem has not simply been solved by better technology in the decades since. The soil is one of the central issues. Much of the Darién lowland is underlain by clay-heavy, waterlogged material that behaves very differently from the gravel and rock that road builders prefer to work with. Clay soil has what engineers call low-bearing capacity. It compresses and shifts under load rather than holding its shape. Building a road on waterlogged clay requires either removing the clay and replacing it with more stable material, which is enormously expensive and logistically difficult in a remote jungle, or driving deep pilings through the clay to reach more stable substrate below, which is even more expensive and requires heavy equipment that is very difficult to get into the Darién in the first place. There is also the problem of what happens when you disturb the surface vegetation. The forest, canopy, and the root systems of the jungle plants are actually doing significant work to hold the soil in place and regulate water absorption. Once you clear the forest to build a road, the exposed soil becomes dramatically more vulnerable to erosion. In a place that receives over 3,000 millimeters of rain per year, erosion is not a minor inconvenience. It is a constant, powerful force that can undermine a road surface in a single wet season. Then there is the Atrato River. The Atrato drains a massive watershed in northwestern Colombia and flows northward into the Gulf of Urabá. It is one of the highest discharge rivers in the world relative to its basin size, a result of the extraordinary rainfall the region receives. The river carries an enormous volume of water, and its floodplain is wide, shallow, and subject to dramatic changes in water level during the rainy season. Bridging the Atrato is not simply a matter of building a long bridge. The river's banks in this region are themselves unstable, composed of the same waterlogged clay and sediment that makes the surrounding land so difficult to build on. Any bridge would need to be designed not just for the river's normal flow, but for its flood conditions, which can shift the channel and deposit or remove sediment in ways that undermine bridge foundations over time. The 1975 study identified the Atrato crossing as one of the single most expensive and technically demanding elements of any route through the gap, regardless of which of the three routes was chosen. Landslides are another recurring problem. The higher terrain in the Darién, particularly along the Serranía del Darién range, is subject to frequent slope failures during the rainy season. The combination of heavy rainfall, steep gradients, and the kind of soil that does not drain well creates conditions where hillsides simply give way. A road cut through this terrain creates new slope faces that are even more vulnerable to failure than the undisturbed hillside. Road crews in other parts of Latin America deal with landslides as a routine maintenance issue, but in the Darién the frequency and scale of potential slope failures, combined with the difficulty of getting equipment and crews into the area quickly, makes this a much more serious problem than it would be elsewhere. There is also the matter of what happens to asphalt in this environment. Standard road surfaces are designed for a range of conditions, but the combination of intense heat, extreme humidity, heavy rainfall, and the kind of soil movement that occurs in the Darién creates conditions that accelerate the deterioration of road material significantly. Roads in other parts of the tropics require more frequent resurfacing than roads in temperate climates. In the Darién, engineers estimated that resurfacing cycles would be dramatically shorter than in comparable tropical regions, because the ground movement beneath the road would create surface damage even before the weather had a chance to do its work. What makes all of this particularly challenging from a logistical standpoint is that the Darién has almost no existing infrastructure to support a major construction project. Building a road somewhere requires, among other things, roads to bring in the equipment and materials needed to build the road. In the Darién, you are essentially starting from nothing. Equipment would need to be brought in by river barge, by helicopter, or by clearing temporary access tracks that would themselves be subject to all the same problems as the road you're trying to build. The study estimated that a significant portion of the project cost would be consumed simply by the logistics of getting construction materials and heavy machinery into position, and that this cost would be very difficult to reduce regardless of how efficiently the actual road building was managed. It is worth noting that the engineers who produced the 1975 study were not concluding that the road was impossible. They were concluding that it was possible, but that it would be extraordinarily expensive, that the maintenance costs would be ongoing and high, and that the technical challenges were of a different order of magnitude than anything else the Pan American Highway project had encountered. The study recommended further analysis before any construction decision was made. That further analysis has been conducted in various forms by various bodies in the decades since. The conclusion has not changed materially. The numbers have gotten larger as inflation and updated cost modelling have been applied, but the fundamental picture the 1975 study painted has held up. Modern engineering offers some tools that were not available in 1975. GPS-guided construction equipment is more precise. Geotextile fabrics can be used to stabilise soft ground in ways that were not practical 50 years ago. Satellite imagery allows for more detailed terrain analysis before crews go into the field. None of these advances changes the basic arithmetic of the Darién. The soil is still waterlogged clay. The Atrato is still one of the world's highest discharge rivers. The rainfall is still over 3,000 millimetres per year in the wettest areas. The remoteness is still a logistical multiplier on every cost. What modern engineering can do, in theory, is build a road that is somewhat more durable and somewhat less expensive than what the 1975 study envisioned. What it cannot do is make the Darién into a different kind of place. There is also the question of what a road through the Darién would actually need to sustain. A road is not a one-time achievement. It is an ongoing commitment. Once built, it requires regular maintenance, emergency repair after flood events and landslides, and the presence of crews and equipment capable of responding quickly when sections are damaged. In a remote jungle environment with the Darién's rainfall patterns, that means maintaining a permanent logistical infrastructure in the region. Fuel depots, equipment storage, worker housing, communication systems and medical facilities for the workers. The cost of that permanent infrastructure year after year would need to be weighed against whatever economic benefit the road provides. The 1975 study gestured at this calculation without fully resolving it, and subsequent analyses have found it equally difficult to resolve in a way that makes the project look financially attractive. Some engineers and infrastructure analysts have suggested that the right answer is not a road at all, but some other form of connection, a rail link perhaps, or a series of ferry crossings combined with short road sections, or some combination of infrastructure types that avoids the worst of the terrain. These proposals have been floated at various points over the decades. None of them has moved past the proposal stage, partly because they face versions of the same logistical and environmental problems as the road, and partly because the political will and funding required to take any of them seriously have never quite materialised at the same time. What the engineering history of the Darién Gap ultimately reveals is that the gap is not the result of a failure of ambition or a lack of technical knowledge. The engineers who looked at this problem were serious, capable people who understood what they were dealing with. The gap persists because the terrain presents a genuinely unusual combination of difficulties that compound each other in ways that make the cost and complexity of a solution very high, and the benefit of that solution, at least in purely economic terms, uncertain enough that it has never cleared the threshold required to actually begin construction. But the engineering argument, as formidable as it is not the only reason the gap has remained. There are other voices in this conversation, and some of them have been arguing with considerable force and with scientific evidence behind them that closing the gap would not just be expensive and difficult, it would be actively harmful. And that argument, which comes not from engineers but from ecologists and agricultural scientists and conservation biologists, has shaped the debate around the Darién in ways that the 1960 Pan American Highway Congress almost certainly did not anticipate. The ecological argument against closing the Darién Gap is not a recent invention. It did not emerge from modern environmental activism or from the kind of reflexive opposition to development that sometimes colours debates about infrastructure in sensitive regions. It is in large part a practical argument made by scientists and agricultural officials who looked carefully at what the Darién actually does as a functioning biological system, and concluded that its value as a barrier is, in certain specific ways, greater than its value as a road corridor. To understand that argument, it helps to start with what the Darién is, ecologically speaking. In 1981, UNESCO designated the Darién National Park as a World Heritage Site. The park covers roughly 575,000 hectares, which makes it the largest national park in Central America. The designation was not honorary. UNESCO's evaluation found that the Darién represented one of the most significant remaining stretches of tropical rainforest in the Western Hemisphere, with a level of biodiversity that placed it among a very small number of truly exceptional ecosystems on the planet. The Biosphere Reserve designation followed, recognizing the Darién not just as a place worth protecting, but as a functioning ecological zone that serves broader regional purposes. The biodiversity figures are worth sitting with for a moment, because they're genuinely striking. Over 500 bird species have been recorded in the Darién. That is more than in most entire countries. The harpy eagle, which is one of the largest and most powerful raptors in the world, a bird that can take a monkey or a young deer from a tree canopy, nests here. So do the great green macaw and the crimson-bellied woodpecker, and dozens of species that are considered vulnerable or threatened elsewhere in their range. The Darién is one of the few places in Central America where jaguars still maintain a viable population. Tapirs move through the forest, giant anteaters, ocelots, white-lipped peccaries in groups of dozens, sometimes hundreds, moving through the understory like slow, dark rivers. The plant diversity is harder to summarise because it is still being catalogued. Botanists working in the Darién have consistently found species that were previously unknown to science, and the pace of discovery has not slowed in recent decades, the way it has in more thoroughly studied tropical regions. The forest here is old in the way that matters biologically. It has not been significantly cleared. It has not been fragmented by agriculture or logging at the scale that has affected most of Central America, and the ecological relationships between its species have had centuries to develop into the kind of complexity that makes tropical rainforests function as they do. A road through this ecosystem would not just cut a line through the forest. Roads in tropical environments do not work the way roads in temperate environments do. In a temperate forest, a road creates an edge effect, a zone of altered conditions on either side of the pavement, but the forest on both sides generally remains intact and functional. In a tropical rainforest, a road acts as a corridor for human activity, and human activity in tropical forests tends to expand outward from roads in ways that are difficult to control. Logging, subsistence farming, hunting, settlement. These activities follow roads into previously inaccessible areas, and the result is typically a pattern of deforestation that extends well beyond the road itself. Researchers studying the Amazon have documented this pattern extensively. A road is not just a road, it is an invitation. Conservation biologists have argued that a paved connection through the Darién would trigger exactly this kind of secondary deforestation, fragmenting one of the last large intact forest blocks in the region and isolating populations of wide-ranging animals like jaguars and tapirs that require large, connected territories to maintain viable breeding populations. Fragmentation is one of the primary drivers of species extinction in tropical forests, not because it kills animals directly, but because it reduces the size and connectivity of the habitats they depend on until those populations become too small and too isolated to sustain themselves over time. These are serious ecological concerns, and they have been part of the Darién debate for decades. But there is another ecological argument that is, in some ways, even more immediately practical, and it comes not from conservation biology, but from veterinary science and agricultural economics. Foot-and-mouth disease, aftosa as it is called in Spanish, is a highly contagious viral illness that affects cloven-hoofed animals, cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, deer, and many others. It is not typically fatal to adult animals, but it causes severe economic damage because it reduces milk production, causes weight loss, can kill young animals, and, most importantly for trade, triggers international restrictions on meat and livestock exports from any country where an outbreak occurs. The economic consequences of a foot-and-mouth outbreak in a major cattle-producing country can run into billions of dollars, and the disruption to agricultural trade can last for years. South America has significant foot-and-mouth disease presence, particularly in certain regions of Colombia, Venezuela, and Brazil, though vaccination programs have made considerable progress in reducing its range. Central America and North America do not have foot-and-mouth disease. The United States has been free of the disease since 1929, and the US agricultural sector is acutely sensitive to anything that might change that status. A single outbreak of foot-and-mouth disease in the United States would have consequences so large that agricultural economists tend to speak about the scenario in terms of tens of billions of dollars in losses and years of disrupted export markets. The Darién Gap is, among other things, a natural barrier that has helped keep foot-and-mouth disease from spreading north. The logic is fairly simple. The disease spreads through direct animal contact, through contaminated equipment and vehicles, through infected meat products, and through the movement of livestock along roads and trade routes. A paved road connecting South America and Central America would create a corridor along which cattle, pigs, and other livestock could be moved, legally or illegally, and along which contaminated vehicles and animal products could travel. The disease could potentially move north along that corridor faster than surveillance systems could detect and contain it. The United States Department of Agriculture has been explicit about this concern for decades. The USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, which monitors agricultural disease threats, has consistently identified the Darién Gap as a critical buffer zone and has consistently expressed concern about proposals that would compromise it. The Inter-American Development Bank, which has funded various Pan-American highway projects over the years, has had to weigh USDA concerns carefully in its deliberations about the Darién section. International agricultural bodies have echoed the concern. The gap in this framing is not just a missing piece of road, it is a biosecurity feature. It is worth being precise about what this argument does and does not claim. It does not claim that a road would automatically cause a foot-and-mouth outbreak in North America. It claims that a road would meaningfully increase the risk of such an outbreak, and that the economic consequences of even a moderate increase in that risk are large enough to warrant serious caution. The argument is probabilistic and economic, not absolute. But when the potential downside is measured in tens of billions of dollars and years of agricultural disruption, even a modest increase in probability is enough to give decision-makers pause. There is a related concern about invasive species, which is somewhat less dramatic but ecologically significant in its own right. The Darién Gap currently functions as a partial barrier to the northward movement of various plant and animal species that are established in South America, but absent from Central America. Some of these species, if they were able to move freely along a road corridor, could establish themselves in Central American ecosystems where they have no natural predators or competitors, with potentially damaging effects on native species. The giant African snail, which is not native to either continent but has established itself in parts of South America, is one example of the kind of invasive species that road corridors can facilitate. The concern is not that a road would immediately cause catastrophic invasions, but that it would make the movement of species, intentional and unintentional, significantly easier. What makes the ecological argument particularly interesting from a narrative standpoint is that it does not oppose the road on purely sentimental or aesthetic grounds. It is not simply saying that the Darién is beautiful and should be preserved because beautiful things deserve preservation, though that argument has also been made and is not without merit. It is saying that the Darién performs specific measurable functions as a disease barrier, as a biodiversity reservoir, as a buffer against ecological disruption, and that those functions have economic and scientific value that needs to be weighed against the economic value of a road connection. That framing has made the ecological argument harder to dismiss than it might otherwise be. Infrastructure advocates can argue against sentiment. It is harder to argue against a USDA risk assessment or a UNESCO biodiversity evaluation. The ecological case for preserving the gap has had institutional weight behind it, and that weight has been a genuine factor in why the road has not been built. There is also something worth noting about the Darién's role in the broader regional water system. The rivers that drain the Darién, the Tuira, the Chucunequi, the Atrato, are significant hydrological features. The Atrato in particular, which flows north from the Colombian interior, through the Darién lowlands to the Caribbean, has one of the highest water discharge rates of any river its size in the world. The forest that covers the Darién watershed plays a role in regulating that discharge, absorbing rainfall, slowing runoff, maintaining the water table in ways that affect communities downstream. Deforestation in the watershed, which a road corridor would likely accelerate, could alter the hydrology of the Atrato basin in ways that are difficult to predict precisely, but that researchers consider potentially significant. Colombian scientists in particular have raised this concern, noting that the Atrato River basin supports communities and agricultural land downstream of the Darién, and that changes to the watershed's forest cover could affect both the volume and the seasonal distribution of the river's flow. In 2016, Colombia's Constitutional Court issued a landmark ruling recognizing the Atrato River as a subject of rights, a legal entity with its own right to protection, conservation, and restoration. The ruling was partly a response to illegal mining activity in the river's upper reaches, but it also reflected a broader recognition that the Atrato is not just a geographic feature, but a living system whose health has consequences for the people and ecosystems that depend on it. None of this is to suggest that the ecological arguments against the road are without counter-argument. Some analysts have pointed out that the foot-and-mouth barrier function of the Darién is not as absolute as it is sometimes presented. The disease has moved between South and Central America through other means, including the movement of people and goods by sea, and the gap does not seal the continents hermetically. Others have noted that the biodiversity of the Darién, while genuinely impressive, is not unique in the sense of being found nowhere else on Earth. Many of its species also occur in other parts of Colombia and Panama, and the loss of the Darién would be a serious blow to conservation, but not an extinction event in itself. These counter-arguments are real, and serious people have made them. But they have not so far been persuasive enough to shift the overall balance of the debate. The ecological case for preserving the gap, taken together with the engineering case for not building the road, has created a situation in which the arguments against construction are numerous, varied, and mutually reinforcing, while the arguments for construction are largely limited to the abstract economic value of a connected road system, a value that has proven difficult to quantify convincingly given the costs and risks involved. What is perhaps most striking about the ecological dimension of the Darién story is how little it was anticipated when the Pan American Highway project was first conceived. In the 1930s and 1940s, when the highway was being planned and built, The idea that a jungle might be worth preserving as a disease barrier or a biodiversity reservoir was not part of mainstream infrastructure thinking. Roads were progress. Jungles were obstacles. The notion that an ecologist or a veterinary scientist might have standing to weigh in on a highway routing decision would have seemed, to many of the project's planners, somewhat eccentric. By the time the 1975 feasibility study was completed, that thinking had begun to change, though the ecological concerns were still not the dominant factor in the analysis. By the 1980s, when the UNESCO designation came through, and the conservation community had developed a more sophisticated understanding of tropical forest ecology, the ecological argument had become a serious part of the debate. And by the 1990s and 2000s, as the science of ecosystem services, the idea that natural systems provide measurable economic benefits that need to be accounted for in development decisions, had matured, the ecological case for the gap had become something that infrastructure advocates could not simply wave away. The Darién, in this sense, is a place where the history of environmental thinking is written into the landscape. The fact that it remains unroaded is partly a story about engineering difficulty and political complexity, but it is also a story about how our understanding of what wild places are worth has changed over the past century. The forest does not know any of this, of course. The jaguars and harpy eagles and still uncatalogued orchids have no idea that their home is the subject of international debate. They are simply living in a place that happens, for a combination of reasons, to have been left largely alone. But left alone does not mean untouched, and the Darién has not been immune to the pressures that have reshaped so much of the tropical world. There are people moving through it, in very large numbers, in ways that are changing the forest and the communities within it. And there are other forces operating inside the gap that have nothing to do with ecology or engineering. Forces that have made the Darién not just difficult to cross, but genuinely dangerous in a very human sense. That dimension of the story is one that the ecologists and the engineers did not fully account for, and it is, in its own way, as formidable as anything the forest itself can produce. The forces in question have been operating in the Darién for decades, and they did not arrive by accident. They arrived because the Darién offered something that is genuinely rare in the modern world: a large, inaccessible, effectively ungoverned space with no meaningful state presence, no roads, no surveillance infrastructure, and a geography that makes outside intervention extraordinarily difficult. For certain kinds of organisations, that combination is not a liability. It is a strategic asset. To understand how the Darién became what it is today from a security standpoint, it helps to go back to the 1990s, when the conflict in Colombia was at one of its most intense periods. The FARC, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, a Marxist guerrilla organisation founded in 1964, had been fighting the Colombian state for decades, and by the 1990s they had expanded their territorial control significantly, particularly in remote jungle regions where the government had little reach. The Darién was a natural fit. It was close to the Colombian coast, it bordered Panama, it was nearly impossible to patrol, and it sat astride some of the most lucrative smuggling routes in the Western Hemisphere. FFA-RC units established a presence in the Colombian side of the Darién that was, for a time, essentially unchallenged. They taxed local communities, controlled movement along river routes, and used the jungle as both a refuge and a logistics corridor. The Colombian government's Plan Colombia, launched in 2000 with significant US funding and military support, pushed FARC units out of some of their traditional strongholds in the Colombian interior. That pressure, paradoxically, pushed more activity toward the margins, including the Darién. The jungle became more important as a sanctuary precisely because it was harder to operate against. Aerial fumigation of coca crops in other regions displaced both the crops and the people cultivating them, some of whom moved toward the Darién watershed. The dynamics were complicated and interconnected in ways that policymakers at the time did not always fully anticipate. The 2016 peace agreement between the Colombian government and the FARC was, by most accounts, a genuine and significant achievement. It ended a conflict that had killed an estimated 220,000 people over more than 50 years. But it did not end the presence of armed groups in the Darién. What happened instead was a fragmentation. FARC dissident groups, factions that rejected the peace agreement and continued operating, maintained a presence in parts of the region. And into the spaces left by the retreating FARC moved other organisations, most notably the Clan del Golfo, also known as the Irabeños or the Gaitanistas. The Clan del Golfo is a paramilitary successor organisation with roots in the demobilised AUC, the right-wing paramilitary umbrella group that officially disbanded in 2006. It is, by most assessments from Colombian security analysts and the United Nations, currently one of the most powerful criminal organisations in Colombia. Its primary business is cocaine trafficking, and the Darién is one of its most important operational corridors. Cocaine produced in Colombia's interior needs to move north towards Central America and eventually to markets in North America and Europe. The sea routes are subject to interdiction. The Darién offers an overland alternative, or more precisely, a river and jungle alternative, that is extraordinarily difficult to monitor or disrupt. The Clan del Golfo does not just use the Darién as a transit zone. It controls it. Tolls are charged, movement is regulated. People who enter without permission or who represent a threat to operations are dealt with accordingly. This is the context in which journalists, aid workers and researchers have operated when they have tried to report from the interior of the Darién. The risks are real and documented. In April 2022, a French journalist named Frédéric Leclerc-Imhoff was killed while covering the migration crisis in Ukraine, which drew significant international attention. Less widely covered were the deaths and disappearances of journalists and humanitarian workers in the Darién in the years prior. In 2021, a Dutch journalist was killed in the region while documenting the migrant crossing. The Committee to Protect Journalists and Reporters Without Borders have both noted the Darién as one of the most dangerous regions in the Western Hemisphere for journalists to operate in, not because of the jungle itself, but because of the armed groups that control access to it. Aid organisations working with migrants in the region have had to navigate careful negotiations with armed actors simply to operate. Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, has maintained a presence at Bajo Chiquito, the first Panamanian village that migrants reach after the crossing, providing emergency medical care. Their staff do not operate in the interior of the Darién. The security situation makes that essentially impossible. The care they provide is triage for people who have already survived the crossing, or for those who have not quite survived it and are found barely alive at the jungle's edge. The Panamanian security forces, specifically Senafront, the National Border Service, have a presence at the entry and exit points of the Darién on the Panamanian side. They are stationed at places like Bajo Chiquito and Lajas Blancas, the processing points where migrants emerge from the jungle. But their capacity to patrol the interior is limited. The terrain works against any sustained security presence. Helicopters can fly over the Darién, and they do. Panama has used aerial surveillance to monitor migrant flows, but aerial observation of a triple canopy forest gives you very little information about what is happening underneath the canopy. The forest conceals almost everything. On the Colombian side, the situation is even more constrained. The Colombian military has conducted operations in the Darién region over the years, and there have been periodic announcements of increased security presence. But the interior of the Colombian Darién remains, for practical purposes, governed by whoever is strongest on the ground at any given moment. That has meant, for most of the past 3 decades, armed non-state actors of one kind or another. The Colombian state's authority in the region is real at the margins, in towns like Turbo and Apartado on the Caribbean coast, in the administrative structures of the Choco department, but it attenuates rapidly as you move inland toward the jungle. What this means for anyone attempting to cross the Darién is that the danger is layered. There is the danger of the terrain and the weather and the rivers. There is the danger of disease, which we will come to later. And then there is the danger of the people operating in the space. And those people are not neutral. The the criminal organisations that control the Darién's interior have found, in the migrant crisis, an additional revenue stream. Migrants pay fees, sometimes called taxes, sometimes simply extortion, to move through territory controlled by the Clan del Golfo or by FARC dissidents. The fees are not optional. People who cannot pay, or who resist, face consequences that range from robbery to violence to abandonment in the jungle. Women crossing the Darién face a specific and serious risk of sexual violence. UNHCR field reports and accounts collected by human rights organisations have documented this pattern consistently. The coyotes, the smugglers and guides who charge migrants for assistance with the crossing, exist on a spectrum. Some are simply local people from border communities who know the routes and charge for that knowledge. Others are more directly connected to the criminal networks that control the corridor, and their interests are not aligned with the welfare of the people they are guiding. There have been documented cases of migrants being robbed and left in the jungle by the guides they pay to help them. There have been cases of migrants being handed over to criminal groups by guides who received payment for doing so. The crossing is dangerous in ways that the forest alone does not explain. It's worth pausing here for a moment, because it would be easy to describe all of this in a way that makes the Darién sound like a place defined entirely by violence and threat. That is not quite accurate, and it is not quite fair to the region or to the people who live there. The indigenous communities of the Darién, the Embera, the Wunan, the Guna, are not criminal actors. They are communities living in a region that has been penetrated by external forces they did not invite and cannot easily resist. The presence of armed groups in the Darién has affected indigenous communities significantly, restricting their movement, threatening their traditional ways of life, and in some cases displacing them from their territories. The Embera communities along the Tuira River have documented cases of armed groups imposing restrictions on fishing, farming and travel along river routes that their communities have used for generations. This is not the Darién's own nature. It is something that has been imposed on it. There have also been periods of relative quiet. The security situation in the Darién is not static. It shifts with the broader dynamics of the Colombian conflict, with government operations, with the internal politics of the criminal organisations themselves. Researchers and journalists who have spent time in the region describe a landscape where normalcy and danger coexist in uncomfortable proximity, where a village might be peaceful and welcoming, and the next river crossing might be controlled by men with weapons who are not interested in conversation. The unpredictability is itself a significant part of the danger. You cannot plan around a threat you cannot reliably locate or anticipate. For the governments of Panama and Colombia, the security dimension of the Darién creates a policy problem that has no clean solution. A road through the gap would, in theory, allow for greater state presence and surveillance. Some analysts have argued this over the years, that the absence of infrastructure is itself a security liability, because it means the state cannot project authority into the region. But this argument has significant weaknesses. A road through the Darién would not automatically bring state authority. It would also bring easier access for the organisations that currently operate there, potentially expanding their reach rather than contracting it. Drug trafficking organisations are not deterred by roads. Roads make logistics easier, not harder. The history of other road building projects in jungle regions of Latin America suggests that infrastructure often benefits criminal networks at least as much as it benefits the state, at least in the short term. There is also the question of what a road would do to the migrant situation. The current crossing is dangerous precisely because it is difficult. A road would make the crossing easier, which would likely increase the number of people attempting it. Whether that would be better or worse from a humanitarian standpoint depends on what you think the alternative is, but it is not a straightforward improvement, and it has made governments cautious about framing infrastructure in the Darién as a migration solution. The security situation in the Darién has, in a strange way, become one of the most effective arguments for leaving the gap as it is, not because the danger is acceptable, but because the alternatives are unclear and potentially worse. This is not a comfortable position. It means that the status quo involves ongoing violence, ongoing exploitation of migrants, and ongoing harm to indigenous communities. But the discomfort of the status quo has not so far generated a credible alternative. The gap persists, and the forces operating inside it persist with it. What is perhaps most striking, when you step back and look at the full picture of the Darien security dimension, is how thoroughly it has been shaped by forces that originate far outside the region. The cocaine that moves through the Darien is produced for markets in North America and Europe. The conflict that created FARC and the paramilitary organizations that followed it was shaped by Cold War politics, US drug policy, and Colombian social inequalities that have nothing to do with the jungle itself. The migrants moving through the Darien are fleeing conditions in Haiti, Venezuela, Ecuador, and elsewhere. Conditions created by political and economic forces operating at a continental scale. The Darien is, in this sense, a place where the consequences of distant decisions accumulate. It is a pressure valve for systems that are failing somewhere else, and it absorbs that pressure in the most physical and immediate way possible. The jungle, for its part, does not distinguish between the drug trafficker and the aid worker, and the migrant family and the indigenous fisherman. It treats them all with the same indifference. The rain falls equally on everyone. The rivers rise without warning for everyone. The insects do not check credentials. And so the people moving through the Darien, whatever their reasons, whatever their resources, face the same fundamental environment, even as the human dangers they encounter vary enormously depending on who they are and what they carry, and who knows they are there. That human layer of danger is real and serious, and it sits on top of everything else the Darien presents. The terrain, the weather, the disease, the distance from help. Add to all of that the possibility of encountering armed men whose interests are not your own, and the crossing becomes something that requires not just physical endurance, but a kind of constant, exhausting vigilance that the forest itself does not allow you to sustain for long. Which brings us to the people who are crossing the Darien in numbers that would have seemed unimaginable even a decade ago. Not the expeditions, not the journalists, not the researchers with satellite phones and evacuation plans. Ordinary people, families, children. People who have calculated, somehow, that the Darien is worth crossing because whatever they are leaving behind is worse. That calculation, and what it costs them, is a story that deserves to be told on its own terms. The numbers alone are difficult to hold in your mind all at once. In 2022, approximately 248,000 people crossed the Darién Gap on foot. That is not a statistic from a conflict zone in the traditional sense. There is no war being fought in the Darien itself. There are no front lines, no evacuation corridors, no international peacekeeping missions. It is a jungle, and 250,000 people walk through it in a single year. Then in 2023, that number more than doubled. Over 520,000 people made the crossing. To put that in some kind of physical context, if you lined up every person who crossed the Darien in 2023 and asked them to walk single file through the gap, the line would stretch for hundreds of kilometres. And yet they did not walk single file. They walked in small groups, in families, in clusters of strangers who had met at the staging point and decided, for safety or for company, to move together into the forest. The crossing begins, for most people, in the Colombian port town of Necoclí. It is a small Caribbean coastal town that, until relatively recently, was known mainly to regional travellers and fishing communities. Now it has become something else entirely. It is a waiting room. Migrants from Haiti, Venezuela, Ecuador, Cuba, and increasingly from countries in Africa and Asia arrive in Necoclí by bus, by boat, by whatever combination of transport has carried them this far. They stay in makeshift camps, in rented rooms, in shelters operated by aid organisations. They wait for a boat. The boat takes them across the Gulf of Urabá, a short crossing, perhaps an hour or two, to the small town of Acandí on the Colombian side of the Darién. From Acandí, the walking begins. The route from Macandí north toward the Panamanian border and then onto the community of Bajo Chiquito on the Panamanian side is roughly 60 to 100 kilometers depending on the path taken. That sounds manageable. It does not sound like something that should take 5 to 10 days, but the train does not care what sounds manageable. The path, and calling it a path is generous, because in many places it is simply the direction that previous groups have walked, marked by discarded belongings and the occasional rope tied to a tree to help with a steep descent. Climbs and drops repeatedly through dense forest, crosses rivers that have no bridges, and passes through areas of mud so deep that people have lost their shoes in it and continued walking barefoot. The rivers are particularly serious. The Acandí River and its tributaries must be crossed multiple times. During the rainy season, these crossings can be genuinely life-threatening. Water levels rise quickly and without much warning. People have drowned in crossings that were manageable an hour earlier. Families travelling with young children face a particular kind of terror at these river crossings. The current is strong, the footing is invisible beneath the brown water, and there is no rescue service waiting downstream. Migrants have described forming human chains to cross, holding onto each other's arms and moving slowly, step by step, feeling for the bottom. Some accounts describe ropes stretched between trees that earlier groups left behind, fraying and unreliable, but something to hold on to. The heat is constant and heavy. The humidity in the Darién sits at levels that make the air feel almost solid. People who have spent time in humid climates know the feeling of stepping outside and immediately being coated in a thin film of moisture. The Darién makes that feeling permanent and inescapable. Clothing does not dry. Boots stay wet. Skin that stays wet for days begins to break down. Blisters that would be minor inconveniences in a normal environment become serious wounds in the Darién, because they do not dry out, because they are constantly in contact with contaminated water and soil, because there is no clean place to rest and no medical care available. The groups moving through the Darién carry what they can, which is usually not enough. Food and water are the most immediate problems. Some groups hire guides, and this is where the criminal dimension intersects directly with the migrant experience. The guides operating in the Darién are not all the same. Some are local men with genuine knowledge of the forest who provide a legitimate service. Others are connected to the criminal networks that control the corridor, and their role is not simply to guide, but to extract. There are documented accounts of guides who lead groups to specific points in the forest, where other armed men are waiting. Robbery is common. Sexual violence against women and girls has been documented extensively by UNHCR field workers and by journalists who have spoken with survivors at the Bajo Chiquito reception point in Panama. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has described the situation in the Darién as a humanitarian crisis, involving systematic violence against migrants. The criminal groups operating in the corridor, connected to the organisations discussed in the previous context of the region's security situation, have essentially monetised the migrant flow. They charge for passage, for guidance, for protection. The protection is sometimes real and sometimes a fiction. People pay because they have no other option, and because the alternative is attempting to navigate the forest alone, which most people correctly assess as worse. The economics of this arrangement are grim. Families who have spent months saving money for the journey find themselves paying again and again at different points along the route, and arriving in Panama with almost nothing. The deaths are documented but incomplete as a record. Panamanian authorities and humanitarian organisations have recovered bodies along the route. People who died of exhaustion, of drowning, of illness, of violence. In 2023, the Panamanian government's figures suggested hundreds of deaths along the route, but researchers and aid workers who work in the region consistently note that the actual number is almost certainly higher. The forest does not give up its dead easily. Bodies in the Darién decompose quickly in the heat and humidity, and many people who die in the interior of the forest are never found. The families of people who disappeared in the Darién often have no way of knowing what happened. A person leaves Necoclí and is never heard from again, and there is no investigation, no notification, no record. children are among those making the crossing in significant numbers. UNICEF has documented thousands of unaccompanied minors crossing the Darién each year, and tens of thousands of children travelling with families. The crossing is hard on adults in good health. For children, for elderly people, for pregnant women, for people with any kind of medical condition, it is something else. There are accounts of women giving birth in the forest, attended by whoever happened to be nearby. There are accounts of people with diabetes running out of insulin, of people with heart conditions collapsing on the steep climbs, of children developing severe respiratory infections from sleeping on wet ground in wet clothing for a week. The Panamanian community of Bajo Chiquito is the first official point of contact for most migrants who survive the crossing. It is a small indigenous Embra community on the Tuira River, and it has been completely transformed by the migrant flow. What was a quiet village of a few hundred people has become, at peak times, a processing point for thousands of arrivals per week. The Panamanian Border Police Agency, Senafront, maintains a presence there, and humanitarian organisations including Médecins Sans Frontières have operated medical posts at various points. The images from Bajo Chiquito during peak crossing periods show something that looks less like a jungle village and more like an emergency camp. People sitting on the riverbank, wrapped in emergency foil blankets, children being treated for dehydration, adults having wounds cleaned and dressed. The particular expression on people's faces of someone who has survived something they are not yet ready to describe. From Bajo Chiquito, migrants are transported by river to the larger town of Meteti, and from there by road to a processing centre called the Lajas Blancas camp. The journey through Panama's official migration system takes additional days and involves its own set of difficulties, but for most people, arriving at Bajo Chiquito represents the end of the worst part. The forest is behind them. There is water that will not make them sick. There are people whose job is to help them, not rob them. The relief in that moment, by all accounts, is profound and exhausted and complicated by the knowledge of how much further there still is to go. What makes the scale of this crossing so difficult to fully absorb is the sheer range of people involved. The common image of migration can sometimes flatten the individuals into a category, and the Darién crossing resists that flattening if you look at it closely. The people crossing the Darién in 2022 and 2023 included Haitian families who had already been displaced once by the 2010 earthquake, and again by political instability, who had spent years in Chile or Brazil before deciding that North America was the only remaining option. They included Venezuelan professionals, doctors, engineers, teachers, who left behind careers and property when the economic collapse made daily life impossible. They included Ecuadorian farmers, Cuban musicians, people from Senegal and Ghana and Bangladesh, who had somehow made their way to South America and were now continuing north. They included people who had been planning this journey for years and people who had made the decision in a matter of weeks. They carried photographs in waterproof bags. They carried the phone numbers of relatives in the United States memorized in case their phones were stolen. Some of them carried almost nothing at all. The question of why the Darién crossing has increased so dramatically in recent years does not have a single answer. The conditions driving migration from Venezuela, Haiti, and other countries have worsened significantly since 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted established migration routes and created new pressures. The political situation in the United States and Mexico affected the calculus of which routes were viable, and in some ways, the Darién crossing became more known as an option precisely because more people were doing it. Information about the route spread through migrant networks and social media, and the crossing became, in a terrible way, normalised as a known path rather than an unthinkable one. There have been attempts to address the crisis. Panama has increased Senafront presence along the route. Humanitarian organisations have expanded their operations at Bajo Chiquito and at the transit camps further north. In late 2023, the Panamanian government announced a new policy aimed at reducing the migrant flow, involving increased enforcement and agreements with Colombia to limit boat departures from Necoclí. The results of these policies have been mixed and contested. Reducing the number of people attempting the crossing is not the same as reducing the number of people who feel they have no other option. What the Darién migrant crisis has done, among other things, is make the abstract difficulty of the gap visible in a way that decades of engineering reports and environmental studies never quite managed. People have always known, in a general way, that the Darién was hard to cross, but 520,000 people attempting it in a single year, with hundreds dying and thousands more carrying the physical and psychological marks of what they survived, that is a different kind of knowledge. It is not abstract. It is documented in UNHCR field reports and in the testimony of survivors and in the photographs taken at Bajo Chiquito of people sitting on the riverbank after a week in the forest. The Darién has always been a place that revealed something about the distance between human intention and physical reality. The engineers who surveyed it in the 1970s understood that distance in terms of cost estimates and soil classifications and river discharge rates. The migrants crossing it today understand that distance in a more immediate way, in the weight of wet clothing, in the sound of a river rising in the dark, in the calculation of whether the food they are carrying will last another 2 days. The gap does not change for them. It is the same jungle, the same rain, the same mud. The difference is only in what they are carrying toward it and what they are leaving behind. And the forest absorbs all of it. The expeditions and the surveys and the policy debates and the hundreds of thousands of people moving through its understory, with the same fundamental indifference it has always shown. The trees do not record what passes beneath them. The rivers do not remember the crossings. The Darién continues to be what it has always been, which is a place that operates according to its own rules, regardless of what anyone outside it decides. The physical experience of being inside that place, not the statistics, not the policy debates, but the actual sensory reality of standing in triple canopy forest with wet boots and no clear sense of which direction is north, is something that the numbers only gesture toward. To understand the Darién more fully, you have to try to understand what it actually feels like to be inside it. And there are people who have documented that experience in careful detail, not because they had to cross it, but because they chose to. The journalist Robert Young Pelton, who has spent a significant portion of his career documenting places that most people prefer to read about from a safe distance, crossed the Darién multiple times and wrote about it with the kind of specificity that only comes from having actually been there. What he described was not dramatic in the way you might expect. There were no single catastrophic moments, no cinematic disasters. What he described instead was accumulation. The Darién works on you slowly, he suggested, through a process of small degradations that compound over hours and days until the cumulative weight of them becomes something genuinely difficult to manage. That description has been echoed by nearly every serious account of the crossing, whether it comes from an adventure journalist, a UNHCR field researcher, or a migrant who agreed to be interviewed after reaching safety. The experience is not one thing. It is 100 small things, layered on top of each other in a place where there is no relief from any of them. The first thing most accounts mention is the humidity, which sounds almost too simple to lead with. Humidity is something people complain about in cities. It is a minor inconvenience. In the Darién, it is a different phenomenon entirely. The forest canopy in a triple canopy rainforest is so dense that very little direct sunlight reaches the understory. What this creates is not shade in the comfortable sense, but rather a closed, pressurized atmosphere where moisture has nowhere to go. The air is not just warm and wet, it is saturated, in the way that a bathroom is saturated after a long shower, except that there is no door to open, no window to crack, and the shower does not stop. Your clothing becomes wet within the first hour, not from rain necessarily, but from the simple act of moving through air that is already at or near its capacity for water. And then it stays wet, for days. The skin beneath wet clothing subjected to constant friction and heat, and the absence of any drying period begins to break down. Rashes develop. Small cuts that would be trivial in any other environment become infected. Blisters form under boots that never dry out, and walking on those blisters for 6 more hours is simply what the day requires. The mud is its own chapter. The clay-heavy soil of the Darién, described in the engineering reports from the 1970s in terms of load-bearing capacity and drainage coefficients, has a more immediate quality when you're standing in it. It grips. It pulls at boots with a suction that is genuinely alarming the first time you encounter it, because the force required to extract your foot is much greater than you expect, and if your boot is not laced tightly enough, the mud will simply keep the boot when you pull your foot out. Experienced guides tape their boots to their legs. Migrants who did not know to do this have walked sections of the route barefoot, which introduces its own set of problems on terrain that is covered in roots and rocks, and, in some areas, the spines of fallen palm fronds that are hard enough to puncture skin. The mud is deepest near the river crossings, where the banks have been churned by thousands of previous crossings into something closer to wet cement than soil. In some sections, the path, if you can call it a path, descends steeply to a river crossing and then rises steeply on the other side, and both the descent and the ascent involve pulling yourself through mud that is sometimes knee-deep, using roots and branches as handholds in heat that makes the effort feel twice as costly as it should. The rivers themselves deserve separate attention. The Darién's river system is fed by some of the highest rainfall totals in the Western Hemisphere, and the rivers respond to rain with a speed that can be genuinely dangerous. A river that was knee-deep when a group entered the forest in the morning can be chest-deep or impassable by afternoon if rain has fallen in the mountains upstream, rain that you may not have seen or heard because the canopy absorbs so much of the sound. Migrants crossing in groups have described reaching a river that earlier crossers had told them was manageable, and finding instead a brown, fast-moving current that they had no real way to assess from the bank. Some crossed anyway, forming human chains, the stronger people positioned upstream to break the current for the weaker ones. Some waited, sometimes for a day or more, for the water to drop. Some turned back, which meant retracing hours of difficult trail with depleted food and water. The Tuira River and its tributaries are the primary obstacles on the central route, and accounts from UNHCR field researchers who interviewed migrants at Bajo Chiquito describe river crossings as the moment most commonly cited as the most frightening part of the journey. Not the gangs, not the mud, not the hunger. The rivers, specifically the way they changed without warning, and the feeling of being in fast-moving water while carrying a child or a backpack and not being entirely sure you were going to make it to the other bank. The forest at night is a different environment from the forest during the day, and not in a way that offers rest. The sounds change completely. The daytime noise of birds and insects, which is already loud enough to make conversation difficult in some areas, gives way to a different register of sound, lower and more continuous, punctuated by calls that most people cannot identify and therefore cannot calibrate as safe or dangerous. The darkness in triple canopy forest is close to total. A headlamp creates a small circle of visibility, and beyond that circle, nothing. People who have slept in the Darién describe the psychological difficulty of lying on wet ground in that darkness, listening to sounds they cannot interpret, in a place where they have no reliable sense of which direction leads out. Disorientation in dense forest is not a metaphor. It is a documented navigational phenomenon. Without visual landmarks, without the ability to see the sky, without any reference point that persists from one position to the next, the human sense of direction becomes unreliable very quickly. People who have become separated from their groups in the Darién have been found hours later, having walked in circles without knowing it. The fer de lance, known in the region by its Spanish name Bothrops asper, is the snake that appears most frequently in accounts of the crossing, and with good reason. It is one of the most venomous snakes in the Americas, responsible for more snakebite deaths in Central and South America than any other species. It is also a snake that does not go out of its way to avoid people. It is cryptic, meaning it blends almost perfectly into the leaf litter on the forest floor, and it tends to remain still rather than retreat when something large approaches. In the Darién, where the trail surface is often obscured by mud or leaves, where people are watching their footing on uneven ground and not necessarily scanning every inch of trail ahead, a feu de lance can be stepped on before it is seen. Migrants crossing the Darién have no antivenom. Medical evacuation from the interior takes hours at minimum and often much longer. A snake bite in the Darién is not automatically fatal, but the combination of the venom's effects, which include severe tissue damage, internal bleeding, and systemic effects on clotting, with the complete absence of treatment options, makes it a genuinely life-threatening event in a way that it would not be in a context where a hospital was accessible. Several deaths documented in the Darién crossing have been attributed to snakebite, and many more have likely gone unrecorded. There is also the cold, which surprises almost everyone who has not been there. The Darién is a tropical forest near the equator, and the temperature during the day is hot, often in the low 30s Celsius, occasionally higher in open areas. But wet clothing in moving air, especially at higher elevations or during rain, drops body temperature faster than people expect. Hypothermia in a tropical environment sounds contradictory, but it is documented and it is real. Migrants who have crossed during heavy rain, who have been wet for multiple days without any opportunity to dry out, who are exhausted and not eating enough, are physiologically vulnerable to hypothermia in a way that they would not be if they were dry and well fed. The body's ability to regulate its own temperature is not unlimited, and the Darién systematically degrades the conditions that make that regulation possible. Field reports from medical workers at Bajo Chiquito describe treating people for symptoms consistent with mild hypothermia even in the middle of the rainy season, which runs roughly from April through November and covers the period when the majority of crossings now occur. Water is another paradox. The Darién has water everywhere. Rivers, streams, standing pools, rain collecting in the broad leaves of the understory plants, and yet drinking most of it without treatment causes illness. Leptospirosis, which is spread through water contaminated by animal urine, is endemic in the region. Waterborne parasites are common. People who run out of purification tablets or whose filters become clogged with sediment, which happens quickly in the Darién's silty rivers, face a choice between dehydration and drinking water that may make them sick in 2 or 3 days. Many drink anyway, and many get sick, and being sick with gastrointestinal illness while continuing to walk 6 to 8 hours a day through difficult terrain accelerates the physical deterioration in ways that are straightforward to describe but difficult to fully convey. The Darién does not offer clean exits. Every problem compounds the others. What the accounts from journalists and researchers make clear, and what the UNHCR field reports from Bajo Chiquito support, is that the psychological dimension of the crossing is as significant as the physical one. The forest scale and density create a sensory environment that is genuinely disorienting over time. There are no views. There are no open spaces where you can look around and get your bearings. There is only the trail immediately in front of you, and the trees on both sides, and the canopy above that filters the light to a dim green, and the sound of the forest that tells you nothing useful about where you are or how far you have to go. People who have crossed describe a kind of temporal distortion that sets in after the 2nd or 3rd day, a loss of the normal rhythm of time, where hours feel both very long and strangely compressed, where the distance covered in a day feels impossible to estimate. Guides who know the route well use rivers as waypoints, because the rivers are the only landmarks that persist. But for people crossing without guides, or with guides who are themselves unfamiliar with the specific terrain, the forest offers no narrative of progress. You are simply in it, and then you are still in it, and then eventually, if you are fortunate, you are not. The people who have written about the Darién most carefully tend to describe it with a kind of reluctant respect that is different from the way writers describe other difficult places. Mountains are hard in ways that feel legible. You can see the summit, you can measure your altitude, you can understand the challenge spatially. Deserts are hard in ways that feel clean and absolute. The Darién is hard in ways that feel intimate and relentless, because the difficulty is distributed through every element of the environment simultaneously, and it does not let up. The heat and the mud and the insects and the rivers and the darkness and the disorientation are all present at the same time, for days, and they interact with each other in ways that make the whole experience more than the sum of its parts. Paul Salopek, the journalist who crossed the Darién in 2012 as part of his Out of Eden Walk project, a multi-year journey tracing early human migration routes on foot, described the Darién section as unlike anything else in his years of walking through difficult terrain. He was well prepared, well funded, and had experienced guides. It still took him weeks, and he emerged from it describing the forest as something that had to be experienced in its own terms rather than compared to anything else. What the documented accounts share, across the very different contexts of adventure journalism and humanitarian field research and survivor testimony, is the same basic observation. The Darién does not announce its danger. It does not present a single obvious obstacle. It presents instead a continuous low-grade, inescapable difficulty that wears at people through time. The danger accumulates, the degradation accumulates. And the forest itself remains entirely indifferent to all of it, to the exhaustion and the fear and the determination and the grief that move through it every day. The trees are the same trees they have always been. The mud is the same mud. The feu de lance on the trail is not waiting for anyone in particular. The river doesn't rise because anyone is trying to cross it. Understanding what the crossing feels like from the inside is important, because it reframes the engineering question and the political question and the humanitarian question in a way that abstract data cannot. When you know what the terrain does to a human body over 5 or 10 days, the 1970s cost estimates of hundreds of millions of dollars begin to feel less like a bureaucratic obstacle and more like a reasonable response to something genuinely formidable. And when you know that hundreds of thousands of people have crossed it anyway, carrying children and photographs and memorized phone numbers, the question of why they chose to do so becomes more urgent. The forest is the same for all of them. The engineers, the adventurers, the migrants. What differs is only what each of them brought to its edge, and what they were hoping to find on the other side. The experience of the crossing is, in that sense, a kind of truth-telling about what the Darién actually is. Not a gap in a road, not a policy problem, not a line on a map, but a physical reality that has been resisting human categories for a very long time. And the people who have moved through it deliberately, who chose it as a destination or a challenge rather than a necessity, have their own particular stories to tell about what it takes to cross something that has defeated so many others. There is a small group of people who crossed the Darién not because they had to, and not because they were running from something or toward something in the way that migrants cross it. They crossed it on purpose, with full knowledge of what it was, because the crossing itself was the point. Their numbers are genuinely small. You could list them in a few minutes, and what is striking about their accounts, when you read them carefully, is not how heroic they sound, but how plainly difficult they make it seem, as if the Darién defeated their expectations not by being dramatic, but by being relentlessly, exhaustingly itself. One of the earliest deliberate crossings in the modern record is the 1960 Land Rover expedition, which is sometimes called the British Trans-Darién Expedition, organised by a team that included Reverend Gary Spicer Simpson and several other expedition members who had the kind of cheerful, practical British determination that sounds almost charming in retrospect, and must have felt very different on the ground. The goal was to drive 2 Land Rovers from Panama to Colombia through the Gap, a crossing that would, in theory, prove that the Pan-American Highway could be completed. In theory. The reality was that the vehicles spent more time being physically dragged, winched, lifted, and carried through the terrain than they spent being driven. The expedition took roughly 3 months to cover the 106 kilometres, 3 months. For a distance that, on a proper road, would take perhaps an hour and a half. They required helicopter supply drops at multiple points because ground resupply was essentially impossible. They had to build temporary bridges, cut their own path through vegetation, and manage the vehicle's mechanical systems under conditions of constant moisture and mud that caused equipment to fail in ways the manufacturers had not anticipated. The Land Rovers were modified before the expedition specifically for jungle conditions, and still the terrain found ways to defeat the modifications. There were river crossings where the vehicles had to be partially disassembled and floated across on improvised rafts. There were sections where the ground was so soft that the vehicles sank to their axles within meters of being placed on a new surface, and the team had to lay logs and vegetation beneath the tyres just to create enough purchase to move forward at all. When they finally emerged on the Colombian side, the expedition was celebrated as a success, and it was in the sense that they completed it. But it had also demonstrated, fairly conclusively, that driving through the Darién was not a practical proposition. 2 heavily modified vehicles, a professional team, helicopter support, and 3 months of effort had covered 100 kilometres of jungle. The lesson was right there in the numbers, even if it took a few more decades for the lesson to fully land. Sebastian Snow was a British adventurer who attempted a solo crossing of the Darién in the early 1950s as part of a larger journey through South America. His account of the experience is one of the earlier first-person records of what the interior actually feels like, and it is not an optimistic document. Snow was not inexperienced. He had travelled widely through difficult terrain before the Darién, but the gap stopped him in a way that other places had not. He managed a partial crossing before illness, and the sheer difficulty of navigation forced him to alter his route. What he described in his writing was a sense of the forest as something that did not simply obstruct movement, but seemed to absorb it, as if effort disappeared into the vegetation without producing proportional progress. He was not being poetic. He was describing a real mechanical problem, in terrain that dense, with no clear path, with ground that gives way underfoot. The energy cost of movement per kilometre is so high that a physically fit person can cover only a few kilometres in a full day's effort. Snow's account is useful, partly because it predates the era of GPS and modern lightweight gear, but the terrain he describes is the same terrain that exists today. The forest does not update. Robin Hanbury-Tennyson crossed the Darién in 1960, the same year as the Land Rover expedition, though by a different method and with a different purpose. He travelled primarily by river and on foot, relying heavily on Indigenous guides and local knowledge rather than on equipment. His account is notable for the degree to which it emphasises the role of the Embra and Wunan communities in making any crossing possible at all. He was explicit about the fact that without local guidance, his crossing would not have happened. The river routes that the Indigenous communities knew, the specific points where rivers were fordable, the particular channels that were navigable by canoe during certain water levels, the campsites that were positioned on ground that would not flood overnight. This knowledge was not something that could be acquired quickly or replicated from a map. It was the product of generations of living in the forest, and it was freely shared with Hanbury-Tennyson in ways that he acknowledged as the essential condition of his survival. His crossing still took weeks, still involved serious physical difficulty, and still left him with a clear understanding that the Darién was not a place that rewarded confidence. It rewarded patience and deference to people who knew it better than he did. Lauren McIntyre spent significant time in the Darién and in the broader Amazonian and Panamanian jungle regions over the course of his career as a photographer and explorer, and his work brought some of the first sustained photographic documentation of the region to international audiences. McIntyre was not primarily a record setter or an expedition leader in the traditional sense. He was a careful observer, and what he documented about the Darién was not the drama of crossing it, but the texture of existing inside it. His photographs and writings captured the forest at a scale and intimacy that made clear why the place resisted reduction to a simple obstacle. It was not a wall, It was a world. Dense, layered, alive in ways that went far beyond what the word jungle typically suggests to people who have not been inside one. McIntyre's contribution to the record of the Darién is less about a single crossing, and more about the accumulated documentation of what the region actually contains, the waterways, the communities, the biological complexity. And his work helped establish the case, years before UNESCO's formal designation, that the Darién was something worth understanding on its own terms rather than simply overcoming. Paul Salopek's crossing in 2012 is perhaps the most carefully documented deliberate crossing of the modern era, partly because Salopek is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who writes with precision about his experiences, and partly because his Out of Eden Walk project, a multi-year journey tracing the roots of early human migration out of Africa on foot, was designed from the beginning to be documented in detail. Salopek entered the Darién from the Colombian side, accompanied by local guides, and walked north toward Panama over the course of several weeks. He was well funded, well prepared, and had the benefit of satellite communication equipment that previous crossings had lacked. He could call for help if something went badly wrong, which is a meaningful advantage in a place where the absence of that option has cost other people their lives. And still, the crossing was genuinely hard in ways that his writing makes clear without dramatizing. He described the mud as a constant, exhausting presence, not the occasional inconvenience of mud on a difficult trail, but a continuous medium through which movement happened, something that had to be negotiated with every step rather than simply walked through. He described the rivers as unpredictable in ways that required constant attention, because a river that was knee-deep in the morning could be chest-deep by the afternoon after rain upstream. He described the canopy as beautiful and as oppressive simultaneously. Beautiful because it was extraordinary, oppressive because it eliminated the sky, and with it the basic human reference point of horizon and open space. He emerged from the Darién describing it as unlike anything else in his years of walking through difficult terrain around the world, and he said this not as hyperbole, but as a straightforward comparative observation from someone who had walked through a great deal of difficult terrain. What connects all of these crossings across their different eras and methods and purposes is the time they took. The Land Rover expedition, 3 months for 100 kilometres, Hanbury-Tennyson's river and foot crossing several weeks, Salopek's crossing weeks with modern equipment and satellite support. Even the fastest documented deliberate crossings by well-prepared expeditions have taken a minimum of 3 to 4 weeks for the full distance. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because the distance involved is not large by any normal measure. 100 kilometres is the kind of distance that a serious runner covers in a day. It is the kind of distance that a bicycle commuter might cover in a long afternoon. It's the kind of distance that, on a highway, disappears in an hour. The Darién makes 100 kilometres into weeks of effort. That compression of scale, the way the terrain transforms distance into something almost unrecognisable, is one of the things that makes the gap genuinely difficult to convey to people who have not experienced it. There have been other crossings, less documented but part of the record. A handful of adventurers and researchers in the 1980s and 1990s made partial crossings or crossings by river that skirted the most difficult interior terrain. Some of these were successful, and some were not completed. The ones that were not completed tend to appear in the record as brief entries: an expedition that turned back after 10 days, a solo traveller who was evacuated with illness, a small group that made it partway before the rainy season made the trail impassable. These partial attempts are in some ways as informative as the successful crossings, because they show where the terrain tends to defeat people, and at what point in the journey the accumulation of difficulty becomes too great to continue. The answer, fairly consistently, is somewhere in the middle. The first few days are hard but manageable. The last few days, for those who make it that far, are hard but end. It is the middle section, the interior, the furthest point from either edge of the forest, where the combination of exhaustion, disorientation, illness, and terrain tends to produce the decision to stop. None of the people who have crossed the Darién deliberately have made it look easy. Not one of them has come out the other side and suggested that the gap was manageable with the right attitude or the right gear. Even the most experienced, the most well-funded, the most carefully guided of them have come out describing it as something that required everything they had. And most of them, when asked, say they would not do it again. That is not a complaint. It is a data point. The Darién is one of those places that tends to satisfy the curiosity that brought people to it, while simultaneously making clear that the curiosity was somewhat naive. You wanted to know what it was like. Now you know. And knowing is enough. What is also worth noting is that the deliberate crossings, the expedition crossings, the adventure journalism crossings, the carefully planned and well-resourced crossings, have always been the exception. They represent a tiny fraction of the people who have moved through the Darién. The vast majority of crossings have been made by people with no expedition budget, no satellite phone, no experienced guides, no helicopter on standby, and no choice. The contrast between the two kinds of crossing is one of the more uncomfortable things to think about when you read the expedition accounts. Salopek crossed with weeks of preparation and professional support, and described it as the hardest thing he had done in years of difficult travel. The migrants who crossed the same terrain with a bag of food and a phone that may or may not have battery left are doing something that the expedition accounts, by comparison, make almost incomprehensible. The terrain is the same, the rivers are the same, the mud and the insects and the darkness are the same. What is different is everything else: the preparation, the resources, the safety net, the choice. And the people crossing without those things are not a small number. They are, in recent years, hundreds of thousands. That contrast between the few who cross deliberately and the many who cross out of necessity is part of what makes the Darién Gap something more than an interesting geographical curiosity. The expeditions tell us what the place is like. The migration crisis tells us what it costs. Both are important, and both point toward the same underlying fact, which is that the Darién's difficulty is not a story that ends with any single crossing. It is a condition that persists, that continues, that is being experienced right now by someone moving through that forest with no certainty of what is on the other side. The deliberate crossings are remarkable precisely because they were chosen. But the unchosen crossings, the ones made out of desperation rather than curiosity, are in many ways the more revealing measure of what the Darién actually demands of the people who enter it. The physical toll of the crossing does not end when people emerge from the forest. The body carries what the Darién does to it for a long time afterward, and the particular ways in which the region's biological environment attacks the human body are, in their own way, as formidable as the terrain itself. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that the Darién produces that is different from ordinary tiredness. Ordinary tiredness comes from effort, from using the body hard and depleting it. What the Darién produces is something closer to a slow drain, a steady withdrawal from reserves that the body does not always realize it is making until those reserves are already gone. Part of what drives that process is the environment itself, not just the terrain, not just the physical labor of moving through it, but the biological environment, the invisible layer of the forest that operates at a scale too small to see and too pervasive to escape. The diseases that live in the Darién are not exotic in the sense of being rare. Several of them are among the most common tropical illnesses in the world. What makes them dangerous in this particular place is not their novelty, but their concentration, their combination, and the near total absence of any meaningful medical response once someone is inside the forest. The Darién does not offer you a clinic. It does not offer you a road to a hospital. It offers you the forest, and whatever the forest contains, and the hours and days it would take to get you out of it if something went wrong. Malaria is the disease most commonly associated with the region, and the strain present in parts of the Darién is not the more manageable variety. Plasmodium falciparum, the most severe of the four main malaria parasites, is well documented in the Colombian and Panamanian border regions. Falciparum malaria moves faster than other strains. It can progress from the first symptoms to severe illness in a matter of days, and in the absence of treatment, it can be fatal. What makes this particularly difficult in the Darién context is that drug-resistant strains of Falciparum have been recorded in parts of the region, meaning that the standard prophylactic medications that travellers take before entering malaria zones are not always reliable protection. Migrants crossing without any prophylaxis at all are essentially moving through a Falciparum endemic environment with no chemical defence, often already weakened by days of exertion and insufficient food, and with no access to treatment if symptoms begin. The Panamanian health authorities have documented malaria cases among migrants emerging from the Darién at Bajo Chiquito and the processing stations further north. In some years, the numbers have been significant enough to strain the limited medical facilities at those border points. The challenge is that malaria's incubation period, the time between the mosquito bite and the appearance of symptoms, is typically 1 to 2 weeks for Falciparum. This means that many people who cross the Darién and emerge from it feeling relatively intact will develop symptoms only after they have already moved on, which makes tracking the true rate of infection across the crossing population almost impossible. Leishmaniasis is less widely known, but in some ways more insidious. It is a parasitic disease transmitted by the bite of infected sandflies, small insects that are essentially invisible in the forest environment, and that bite without any sensation that would alert you to what is happening. The disease comes in several forms. Cutaneous leishmaniasis, the most common form in the Darién region, causes lesions on the skin, ulcers that can grow to several centimetres, and that, without treatment, can persist for months or years. Mucocutaneous leishmaniasis, a more severe form, can spread to the mucous membranes of the nose and mouth and cause serious tissue destruction. Visceral leishmaniasis, the most dangerous form, affects internal organs and can be fatal without treatment. The incubation period for leishmaniasis is longer than malaria, weeks to months in some cases, which means it is even harder to trace back to the Darién crossing once symptoms appear. Researchers and health workers who have spent extended time in the region have documented cases among themselves, which gives some indication of how readily the disease is acquired even by people who are not moving through the forest under the kind of physical stress that migrants experience. The sandflies that carry it thrive in exactly the conditions the Darién provides: humid, forested, with plenty of standing water and decaying organic matter. The forest, in this sense, is not just a physical obstacle. It is a reservoir of biological risk that is essentially invisible until it has already made contact. Leptospirosis is another disease that the Darién delivers quietly. It is a bacterial infection spread through water contaminated by the urine of infected animals. Rats, cattle, dogs, and a range of wild mammals can all carry the bacteria, and the Darién has no shortage of any of them. For people crossing the Darién, river crossings are unavoidable. Standing water is unavoidable. Mud is unavoidable. The bacteria enter the body through cuts or abrasions in the skin, or through mucous membranes, or through water swallowed during a river crossing. Mild leptospirosis produces fever, headache, and muscle pain, symptoms that are easy to dismiss as general exhaustion in the context of a multi-day jungle crossing. Severe leptospirosis, called Weil's disease, can cause liver and kidney failure. Without antibiotics, the severe form carries a meaningful fatality rate. The particular cruelty of leptospirosis in this context is that its early symptoms are so generic. Fever and muscle pain after 5 days of walking through jungle in wet clothes are not surprising. They're almost expected. The signal is lost in the noise of the crossing itself, which means people who are developing serious leptospirosis infections often have no way of knowing it until the infection has progressed beyond what rest alone can address. And rest, inside the Darién, is not a treatment. It is just a pause. Dengue fever is the 4th major disease in the Darién's biological arsenal, and unlike the others, it is transmitted by a daytime biting mosquito, Aedes aegypti, which means that the standard practice of using mosquito nets at night offers no protection against it. Dengue presents with high fever, severe joint and muscle pain and headache. The joint pain is intense enough that dengue is sometimes called breakbone fever, which gives you some sense of the experience. Most dengue infections resolve without treatment, but severe dengue, which can involve internal bleeding and organ damage, requires medical attention. There is no specific antiviral treatment for dengue, only supportive care, and supportive care is not available inside the Darién. What makes the disease environment of the Darién particularly formidable is not any single one of these illnesses in isolation. It is the fact that they coexist in the same space, transmitted by different vectors, with different incubation periods and different symptom profiles, and that a person moving through the forest for 5 to 10 days is potentially being exposed to all of them simultaneously. The mosquitoes that carry malaria bite at dawn and dusk. The sandflies that carry leishmaniasis bite at night. The daytime mosquitoes carry dengue. The rivers carry leptospirosis. The forest, in other words, operates in shifts, and the biological risk does not take a break between them. The heat and humidity that make the Darién so physically exhausting also make these diseases more efficient. Mosquitoes reproduce faster in warm standing water. Sandfly populations are denser in humid forested environments. Bacteria multiply more rapidly in warm conditions. The forest climate, which is already hostile to human comfort, is essentially optimized for the organisms that cause these diseases. This is not a coincidence. These diseases evolved alongside this kind of environment, and the Darién has been providing ideal conditions for them for a very long time. The Senafront officers, Panama's National Border Service, who are stationed at Bajo Chiquito, and the jungle posts along the migrant route have documented their own exposure to the region's health risks. Officers who rotate through extended assignments in the interior have reported elevated rates of malaria, skin infections and gastrointestinal illness compared to postings elsewhere in the country. These are trained personnel with access to prophylactic medications, proper equipment, and regular rotation schedules. They are not crossing the Darién under duress. They are stationed at fixed points with logistical support, and even under those conditions, the biological environment of the Darién produces a measurable health burden on the people who work within it. This is worth noting not to alarm but to calibrate. If the health impact is measurable among supported, equipped personnel in fixed positions, the impact on people crossing the terrain on foot over multiple days without medical support is considerably higher. Medical evacuation from the interior of the Darién is not a simple problem. The nearest hospitals with any meaningful capacity are in Metiti or La Palma in Panama, or in Turbo or Apartado in Colombia. Getting from the interior of the Darién to any of these facilities involves a combination of river travel by canoe and then road travel, a process that can take anywhere from several hours to more than a day depending on where in the forest you are and what the river conditions are like. Helicopter evacuation is theoretically possible but practically limited. The forest canopy makes landing impossible in most of the interior, and the number of suitable clearings is small. Weather in the Darién can ground aircraft for days at a time. The combination of these factors means that for most people inside the forest, a medical emergency is essentially a problem they have to survive on their own until they can get out. There is a particular kind of injury that the Darién produces that is not a disease, but behaves like one in its accumulation. Skin breakdown, the result of days of continuous moisture, friction and heat, is nearly universal among people who cross the Darién on foot. Feet that are wet for 5 to 10 days develop maceration, a softening and breakdown of the skin that makes blisters inevitable and makes those blisters become infected almost as quickly as they form. Infected blisters in a tropical environment without antibiotics and without the ability to keep the wound dry can progress to serious cellulitis, a spreading bacterial infection of the skin and underlying tissue, within days. This is not a dramatic injury. It is a quiet one, but it is one that has stopped crossings and required evacuations, and in some cases has led to serious complications in people who had no access to treatment. The fer de lance, Bothrops asper, is the snake most commonly associated with danger in this part of Central and South America, and it lives in the Darién in numbers that reflect the forest's general abundance of life. It is a large pit viper, often reaching well over a metre in length, and it is not shy. It hunts at night and tends to rest in leaf litter and along riverbanks during the day, precisely the terrain that people crossing the Darién move through constantly. Its venom is hemotoxic, meaning it attacks the blood's ability to clot, and a serious envenomation without anti-venom treatment can be fatal. Anti-venom is not available inside the Darién. The nearest supplies are in the hospitals that are hours away by river. For most people crossing the forest, a serious snake bite is a crisis for which there is essentially no good answer. This is not meant to suggest that snake bite is a common cause of death in the Darién. It is not, compared to the diseases and the drowning risks and the violence of criminal gangs, but it is part of the texture of the risk, part of the reason that experienced guides move carefully through the forest, checking the ground before each step, and why the psychological weight of the crossing goes beyond simple physical exhaustion. The forest requires a particular kind of attention that does not allow for the mental rest that ordinary walking provides. Every step is a small decision. Every piece of ground has to be assessed. Over days, this sustained alertness produces its own form of depletion. The psychological dimension of illness in the Darién is also worth noting. People who develop fever inside the forest, from malaria, from dengue, from leptospirosis, from any of the other causes, face a particular challenge that goes beyond the physical symptoms. Fever in a tropical environment, combined with dehydration and exhaustion, can produce confusion and disorientation. In a forest where losing your sense of direction is already easy for people who are fully alert, the cognitive effects of fever can be genuinely dangerous. There are accounts from field workers and from migrants who have described companions becoming confused and wandering off trail during illness, or being unable to continue moving and having to be supported or carried by others in the group. In expedition contexts, this is a manageable problem with the right support structure. In the context of a migrant crossing with no guide and no medical support, it is a much more serious one. What the Darién's biological environment does, taken all together, is add a layer of risk that is invisible in the way that terrain risk is not. You can see a flooded river. You can feel the exhaustion of climbing through mud. The biological risks of the Darién are not visible. They are being delivered by insects too small to notice, by water that looks the same as any other water, by the air itself in a sense, by the simple fact of being in this particular forest for this particular length of time. The terrain announces itself, the biology does not. It works quietly over days and weeks, and its effects often appear only after the person has already left the forest, which is part of what makes understanding the true health cost of the Darién crossing so difficult to measure. The health dimension of the Darién is one of the reasons that any serious discussion of the region, whether about road construction, migration policy or conservation, has to account for what the environment does to human bodies over time. Workers building a road through the Darién would face these same diseases. Maintenance crews living near the forest would face them. The infrastructure question and the health question are not separate. They are the same question asked from different angles. And all of this, the malaria, the leishmaniasis, the leptospirosis, the snakes, the infected skin, the fever that arrives without warning, is part of why the Darién has resisted not just roads, but the sustained human presence that building and maintaining a road would require. You cannot build something in a place where the place is actively working against the people doing the building, not without enormous cost, and not without a clear answer to the question of whether the cost is worth it. That question, the question of whether the gap should be closed at all, and why it has remained open for so long despite decades of plans and promises, is one that pulls together every thread we've been following. The terrain, the ecology, the politics, the migration, the disease, the history of failed crossings, all of it feeds into the same unresolved question. And the answer, it turns out, is not simple. because the reasons the road has never been built are not simple either. So let's try to hold all of that together at once. The terrain, the rainfall, the disease, the history, the politics, the people crossing on foot, the engineers who came and measured and left. Take all of those separate threads and try to ask the single question that sits underneath all of them. Why, after more than 60 years of official promises and detailed feasibility studies and genuine political will at various moments, has the road simply never been built? The honest answer is that there is no single reason, and that is actually the most important thing to understand about the Darién Gap. If there were one clear obstacle, one insurmountable engineering problem, one decisive political veto, one ecological argument that settled the debate permanently, then the story would be simpler. But the gap persists because every reason that exists for not building the road reinforces every other reason, and together they form something more than the sum of their parts. They form a kind of institutional paralysis, where the cost and complexity of the project has always been just slightly beyond what any combination of governments and funding bodies has been willing to commit to. Start with the money. The 1971 to 1975 joint survey conducted by the United States and Panama produced cost estimates ranging from $147 million to $400 million in 1970s figures. That was already a significant range, almost a threefold difference depending on which route was chosen and what assumptions were made about construction conditions. In today's terms, those figures translate to somewhere between $700 million and nearly $2 billion for construction alone, and modern independent estimates for a road through the Darién tend to cluster in the range of $500 million to well over $1 billion, depending on the standard of the road and the route selected. These are not small numbers for a 106-kilometre stretch of highway. For comparison, major highway construction in the United States typically runs between $2 and $10 million per mile for relatively straightforward terrain. The Darién would not be straightforward terrain by any definition of the word, but the construction cost is almost the smaller problem. The larger problem is maintenance. Roads in tropical rainforest environments degrade at rates that would astonish anyone accustomed to building infrastructure in temperate climates. The combination of extreme rainfall, waterlogged clay soil, intense biological activity, roots, vegetation, insects, fungi, and the absence of a stable dry season means that road surfaces and environments like the Darién can begin deteriorating within months of completion. Landslides reopen, drainage systems clog, bridges require constant inspection and repair. Engineers who have studied the region have suggested with some seriousness that the annual maintenance cost for a road through the Darién could exceed the annualized construction cost within a decade or two of opening. You would essentially be building the road again, continuously, forever. That is not an engineering argument against the road so much as an economic one, and it is an argument that has never been adequately answered. Panama and Colombia have both expressed genuine interest in closing the gap at various points in their histories. In the 1970s, there was real momentum. The Pan American Highway Congress had committed to the idea, the joint survey had been completed, and there was a sense that this was a problem that modern engineering could solve if the funding could be assembled. But the funding was never assembled. The United States, which would have been the primary financial backer given its interest in a continuous highway connection to South America, pulled back. And the reason it pulled back had less to do with the engineering and more to do with a disease that most people outside the agricultural industry had never heard of. Foot-and-mouth disease, known in Spanish as fever aftosa, is a viral illness that affects cloven-hoofed animals, cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, deer. It is not dangerous to humans, but it is economically catastrophic for livestock industries. It spreads rapidly through direct contact, through contaminated soil and water, and potentially through the movement of animals along shared routes. Central America and North America have been free of foot-and-mouth disease for decades, a status that has enormous economic value for the livestock and meat export industries of the United States, Mexico, Canada, and the Central American nations. South America has had recurring outbreaks. The Darién Gap, in its current state, functions as a natural quarantine barrier. No livestock can move overland between South America and Central America. The gap stops them. The United States Department of Agriculture, along with international agricultural bodies, has consistently identified the closure of the Darién Gap as a serious biosecurity risk. The concern is not hypothetical. It is based on modelling of how quickly foot and mouth disease could spread northward through Central America and into Mexico and the United States if the land barrier were removed and cattle and other livestock began moving along a continuous road corridor. The economic damage from a single foot and mouth outbreak in the United States has been estimated in the tens of billions of dollars. The cost of preventing such an outbreak from the USDA's perspective includes keeping the Darién Gap exactly as it is. This argument has been one of the most consistent and powerful forces against road construction, and it has been applied in international discussions every time the topic has come up seriously. It is a practical argument, not a sentimental one, and it carries significant institutional weight. The ecological argument runs alongside the agricultural one, and the two reinforce each other without being identical. The Darién was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1981, and it holds Biosphere Reserve status, recognitions that reflect its extraordinary biological importance, but that also create legal and diplomatic obligations for Panama and Colombia as signatories to international conservation agreements. Building a major road through a UNESCO World Heritage Site is not simply a matter of political will. It requires navigating a complex set of international obligations, and it invites scrutiny and opposition from conservation organisations that have, over the decades, become increasingly effective at influencing infrastructure decisions in ecologically sensitive areas. Beyond the formal protections, there is the practical ecological concern that a road corridor through the Darién would function as a channel for biological disruption. Roads in tropical forests are not neutral. They fragment habitat, create edges where invasive species move more easily, increase access for hunters and loggers, and alter drainage patterns in ways that affect far more than the road's immediate footprint. The Amazon provides a well-documented example of this dynamic. Roads built for one purpose tend to attract secondary development, settlement, and resource extraction that were not part of the original plan. A road through the Darién would almost certainly attract the same pressures, and the ecosystem it would disrupt is one of the most biodiverse in the Western Hemisphere. The harpy eagle, the jaguar, the tapir, the Baird's tapir specifically, these are animals that require large connected territories of intact forest. A road is not just an inconvenience for them, it is a barrier and an accelerant of the pressures that threaten them. Then there is the political dimension, which has its own particular texture in the Darién. The presence of armed groups, FARC dissident factions, the Clan del Golfo, smaller criminal organisations, in the Colombian portion of the Gap has made any sustained infrastructure project in the region essentially impossible to protect. You cannot build a road if you cannot guarantee the safety of the workers building it, and you cannot maintain a road if armed groups can destroy or extort the infrastructure at will. The Colombian government has spent decades attempting to establish meaningful security presence in the Darién region with limited success. The terrain that makes road construction difficult also makes military and police operations difficult. The same rivers and forests that swallow engineers swallow security forces, and armed groups that have operated in this environment for decades have a knowledge advantage over any outside force trying to operate against them. This security dimension has also introduced a newer and more uncomfortable political calculation into the discussion of the Darién Gap. As the number of migrants crossing the gap has risen dramatically, from tens of thousands per year to hundreds of thousands, some analysts and policymakers have begun to argue quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, that the gap's difficulty serves a useful function as a deterrent. If the crossing were easier, the argument goes, even more people would attempt it. The suffering built into the journey, the days of walking, the criminal gangs, the river crossings, the disease, functions in this framing as a form of border enforcement that no government has to officially implement or defend. It is a grim argument, and it is not one that most officials will make publicly, but it shapes policy in ways that are visible if you look at what governments have chosen not to do. Panama has increased its border enforcement at the northern end of the gap, at Bajo Chiquito and the processing stations beyond it, without doing anything meaningful to make the crossing itself safer or shorter. The gap's hostility is, from this perspective, a feature of the migration management system rather than a problem to be solved. This is one of the more uncomfortable ironies of the Darién's current situation. A place that was long described as an obstacle to connectivity, a gap that needed to be closed for the sake of hemispheric integration, has become, for certain political actors, something closer to a useful barrier. The rhetoric of closure and connection, which dominated discussions of the Pan-American highway for decades, has given way to a quieter, more ambivalent politics in which the gap's impermeability is no longer simply a problem to be solved, but a condition to be managed and in some cases preserved. What makes this especially layered is that the people most affected by the gap's difficulty are not the governments debating its future, or the agricultural lobbies protecting their interests, or the conservation organisations monitoring its ecosystems. They are the people walking through it, the more than 520,000 people who crossed in 2023 alone. The families from Venezuela and Ecuador and Haiti and Senegal and China and dozens of other countries who have calculated that 5 to 10 days of genuine physical danger in the Darién is preferable to whatever they are leaving behind. These people are not part of the political calculation in any meaningful sense. They are moving through a place whose political status is being decided by actors who are not in the forest with them, and whose suffering is documented in UNHCR reports and journalistic accounts that are read and noted and then filed, while the broader policy debate continues essentially unchanged. The gap, then, is not simply the result of engineering difficulty, or ecological protection, or agricultural biosecurity, or political instability. It is all of these things simultaneously, and they interact with each other in ways that make any single solution essentially impossible. A government that wanted to build the road would face at the same time the engineering cost, the maintenance cost, the international agricultural objection, the UNESCO obligations, the security problem, the environmental opposition, and the political backlash from any country in North America that perceived a biosecurity risk. No combination of political will and funding has ever been sufficient to overcome all of those forces at once. And so the gap remains, not because anyone decided it should remain exactly, but because the forces against closing it have always been stronger, collectively, than the forces for closing it. There is something almost structural about this. The Darién Gap is not maintained by any single decision or any single authority. It is maintained by the accumulated weight of dozens of separate interests, each of which has its own reason to prefer the status quo, and none of which needs to coordinate with the others to produce the same outcome. The USDA does not need to talk to the jaguar conservationists. The Clan del Golfo does not need to coordinate with the Panamanian government's migration policy. Each actor pursues its own interest, and the combined effect is that the gap stays closed. It is a kind of emergent preservation, not planned, not designed, but deeply stable because it is reinforced from so many different directions. This is also why proposals to close the gap have tended to fade rather than fail dramatically. There is rarely a decisive moment where a plan is rejected and the decision is made final. Instead, proposals attract objections from multiple directions. The momentum behind them dissipates, funding is not secured, political attention moves elsewhere, and eventually the proposal is simply no longer being actively pursued. It does not die, it just stops. And then years later, someone proposes again, and the same process begins again, and the same outcome is reached through the same gradual accumulation of obstacles. This has happened, in various forms, at least 4 or 5 times since the 1960s. The gap has outlasted every plan that has been drawn up to close it. What this means, practically, is that the question of whether the Darién Gap will ever be bridged by a road is not really a question about engineering or even money. It is a question about whether the political conditions will ever exist in which enough of those separate interests align toward closure rather than preservation. And looking at the current trajectory, the growing weight of the migration crisis, the strengthening of ecological protections, the persistent security problems in the Colombian interior, the ongoing agricultural biosecurity concerns, it is difficult to see those conditions emerging in any near-term timeframe. The gap is not frozen. Things are changing in the Darién, and they are changing in ways that will matter. But the direction of that change and what it means for the future of this strange, stubborn, 106-kilometre break in the longest road in the world, that is a question worth sitting with a little longer. So what does the future of the Darién actually look like? Not in the abstract sense of what people hope for, but in the concrete sense of what is being proposed, what is being tested, and what the land itself seems to be doing in response to all of it. The honest answer is that the future of the Darién looks less like a resolution, and more like a gradual accumulation of smaller changes, none of which amount to anything like the original vision of a completed highway. The grand project, the road that would finally close the gap, the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the convoy of vehicles driving uninterrupted from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, that version of the future seems further away now than it did in 1960, not because the engineering has become harder, but because everything surrounding the engineering has become more complicated. What is actually being discussed in serious policy circles and development bank meetings is a different kind of intervention entirely. The Inter-American Development Bank, which has historically been one of the main institutions involved in Pan-American infrastructure financing, has in recent years shifted its framing around the Darién. Rather than asking how to build a road through the gap, some analysts and researchers within that conversation have started asking a different question. What would it mean to invest in the communities that already live there on their own terms, rather than building infrastructure designed primarily to allow outsiders to pass through? This is a genuinely different kind of thinking, and it is worth pausing on for a moment, because it represents a real shift in how the Darién is being conceptualized at the policy level. For most of the 20th century, the gap was framed as a problem of connectivity. The road stopped, and the road needed to continue. The people who lived in the Darién were, in most of those conversations, either ignored entirely or treated as a secondary consideration, a population that would need to be accommodated somehow in the process of building the infrastructure that the hemisphere required. The Embera and Wunan communities, the Guna villages along the rivers, the small mestizo settlements that had grown up around the gap's edges. They appeared in the planning documents, but they did not drive them. The road was the goal. The communities were a factor. What some researchers and development specialists are now proposing is essentially the inverse of that logic. Rather than building infrastructure for transit, a road designed to move people and goods through the Darién as quickly as possible. The argument is for investment in the region's existing communities, improved river transport, medical facilities, communications infrastructure, schools, economic development tied to the forest, rather than requiring its clearing. This would not close the gap in the highway sense. It would not allow trucks to drive from Panama City to Bogotá. But it would address the actual needs of the people who live there, which is something that 60 years of highway planning has almost entirely failed to do. Whether this reframing will translate into actual policy and actual funding is a different question. Development bank discussions are not the same as construction projects, and there is a long history of well-intentioned proposals for the Darién that have not survived contact with political reality. But the fact that the conversation is shifting in this direction at all says something about how the region is being understood. There are also more specific, more technical proposals being tested right now, with varying degrees of seriousness. One of the more interesting is the use of drone delivery corridors for humanitarian supplies. Several organisations working with migrant populations in the Darién have been exploring whether unmanned aerial vehicles could be used to deliver medical supplies, food, and communications equipment to remote points along the crossing route. The terrain that makes road building essentially impossible is not an obstacle to a drone. The triple canopy forest, the waterlogged valleys, the swollen rivers, none of that matters to something flying at a few hundred meters. Small-scale tests have been conducted. The logistics are not simple, and the coverage is nowhere near sufficient for the scale of the crisis. But the basic concept works in a way that road construction does not. There has also been renewed discussion of a rail link. This idea surfaces periodically, usually attached to broader regional integration proposals, and it has the appeal of being able to use a narrower right-of-way than a highway, potentially with less environmental disruption. A rail line through the Darién would still face enormous engineering challenges, the same unstable soils, the same river crossings, the same rainfall, but the footprint would be smaller, and the argument for it can be made in terms of freight rather than passenger traffic, which changes the economic calculus somewhat. The most recent serious discussion of a Darién rail link that attracted any significant attention was in the early 2010s, and it did not advance past the proposal stage. As of now, there is no funded active rail project for the gap. The idea exists, but it exists in the same category as many Darién proposals: plausible in principle, stalled in practice. What is not stalled, and what is very much active, is the Panamanian government's approach to the migration crisis at the gap's northern end. In 2023, the Panamanian government under President Laurentino Cortizo, and then under his successor José Raúl Mulino, who took office in 2024, moved to significantly increase enforcement at the border and reduce the flow of migrants through the gap. Mulino made closing the Darién route a central campaign promise, and after taking office he implemented a policy of receiving migrants who had already crossed but actively working to deter future crossings, including through agreements with Colombia to increase enforcement on the southern side. The numbers did begin to drop in 2024 compared to the peak of 2023, though the crossing did not stop. This enforcement approach does not change anything about the Darién itself. The forest is the same, the rivers are the same, the gangs operating inside the gap are largely the same. What changes is the political signalling around the crossing, the message that Panama is attempting to send to potential migrants about whether the route is viable. Whether that message actually reaches the people making the decision to cross, and whether it changes their calculus, is something researchers are still trying to understand. The evidence from other migration corridors suggests that people who have decided to move rarely change course because of enforcement signals alone, especially when the conditions pushing them out of their home countries remain unchanged. Then there is the question of what the Darién itself is doing, not as a political object, but as a physical place. And here the picture is genuinely complicated, because the climate is changing in ways that affect the region's hydrology and ecology, in ways that are not yet fully understood. Researchers studying rainfall patterns in the Darién and the broader Choco bioregion have noted that the dry season, already short and unreliable by the standards of most tropical regions, appears to be becoming shorter and less predictable. This matters enormously for the gap. The dry season, roughly from January to April, is the period during which the ground is at its least saturated, the rivers are at their lowest, and movement through the forest is marginally more feasible. If that window is shrinking, the already narrow margin for any kind of overland activity in the Darién becomes narrower still. Conversely, some models suggest that rainfall intensity during the wet season may be increasing, meaning not just more rain overall, but heavier individual rain events that cause faster and more severe flooding of the cienagas and river systems. For road engineers, this would be catastrophic news. A road that might have been maintainable under historical rainfall patterns would be even less maintainable under projected future conditions. The soil erosion rates, the landslide frequency, the frequency of bridge-level flooding, all of these would increase. The 1970s feasibility study, which already concluded that the engineering was barely viable under existing conditions, was conducted before anyone had a clear picture of how significantly the regional climate might shift. If that study were conducted today, with current climate projections factored in, it is hard to imagine the conclusions being more optimistic. For the forest itself, the picture is different, and in some ways more alarming. The Darién's extraordinary biodiversity is, in part, a product of its stability over very long timescales. The forest has been largely undisturbed for thousands of years, and the species assemblages that have developed there, the harpy eagles, the tapirs, the extraordinary density of amphibian species, the plant communities that are still being formally described by botanists, reflect that long continuity. Climate change disrupts that continuity. Shifting rainfall patterns change the timing of flowering and fruiting, which affects the animals that depend on those resources, which affects the predators that depend on those animals. The cascade of effects through a complex ecosystem like the Darién is not something anyone can predict with confidence. What researchers do know is that the forest's resilience depends heavily on its intactness, and that intactness is currently being stressed from multiple directions simultaneously. The migrant crossing is one source of stress that is often overlooked in ecological discussions of the Darién. 520,000 people walking through a forest in a year leaves a mark. Campsites, waste, trails that widen with use, river crossings that disturb bank vegetation, hunting pressure as desperate people look for food. These are not catastrophic impacts individually, but they are not nothing either. Researchers working in the region have documented increased human presence along the main crossing corridors, and there is concern about what sustained high-volume foot traffic does to the forest floor and the waterways over time. This is not an argument against the people crossing. They're doing what they need to do to survive, but it is a real ecological consideration that adds another layer to an already complicated situation. What none of the current proposals address, and what may be the most significant long-term question about the Darién, is what happens to the region if the conditions that have kept it intact begin to erode from within rather than from outside. The security situation in the Colombian interior remains deeply unstable. FARC dissident groups and the Clan del Golfo continue to operate in the region, and their presence shapes everything: the movement of migrants, the ability of researchers and aid workers to access the area, the willingness of governments to invest in infrastructure that might be seized or taxed by armed groups. As long as that security environment persists, the kind of sustained, careful development that might actually benefit the Darién's communities is essentially impossible to implement. The Panamanian side of the border is somewhat more stable, but Senafront, the Panamanian Border Security Force, is stretched thin across a vast and difficult terrain. The officers stationed at remote posts like Bajo Chiquito are doing genuinely difficult work under genuinely difficult conditions, and the resources available to them are not commensurate with the scale of what they are being asked to manage. The 2023 and 2024 increases in enforcement have come with some additional resources, but the fundamental challenge of maintaining any kind of meaningful state presence in a region this remote and this physically hostile has not been solved. So when you try to draw a picture of the Darién's future, what you end up with is not a clear trajectory, but a set of competing pressures, none of which is moving strongly enough in any single direction to produce a decisive outcome. The road is not being built, and the conditions for building it are not improving. The communities living in the gap are not being meaningfully served by the current policy environment. The migrant crisis is being managed at the edges rather than addressed at the source. The ecology is under increasing stress from climate change and human movement. The security situation is neither improving dramatically nor collapsing entirely. Everything is in motion, and nothing is resolving. There is one thing that does seem clear, and it is perhaps the most important thing to say about the Darién's future. The conversation about it is changing. For most of the 20th century, the dominant frame was engineering and connectivity. How do you build a road through this place? That frame has not disappeared, but it has been joined by other frames that did not have the same prominence before. The humanitarian frame, focused on the people crossing and the conditions they face. The ecological frame focused on what the forest is and what it would cost to lose it. The community frame focused on the people who actually live there and what they need. The climate frame focused on what the region is becoming rather than what it has been. None of these frames, individually, is sufficient to produce a policy response equal to the complexity of the situation. But the fact that they are all now part of the conversation, that the Darién is being discussed in terms of ecology and migration and community development and climate, and not only in terms of highway engineering, suggests that at least the understanding of what the gap is and what it means is becoming richer and more honest. Whether that richer understanding will translate into anything that actually helps the people walking through the forest right now, or the communities living along its rivers, or the animals navigating its canopy, that is a much harder question. And it is one that the Darién itself, in its patient, indifferent way, will continue to answer on its own terms, regardless of what is decided in any capital city or development bank meeting room. What this place will look like in 20 years, whether the forest will still be as dense, whether the crossing route will still be as deadly, whether any of the proposals being floated today will have found their way into actual implementation, is genuinely unknown. The Darién has surprised everyone who has tried to predict its future before. There is not much reason to think that pattern is about to change, and yet, knowing all of this, the history, the ecology, the human cost, the politics, the sheer physical reality of what the place is, there is still something that pulls at the imagination when you think about that 106-kilometre break in the longest road in the world. Something about what it means that such a place still exists. Something about what it says about the world and about us. That it has persisted this long, and that it is still persisting now. That pull is worth sitting with for a moment. Not rushing past it, not trying to explain it away. Because there is something genuinely strange and genuinely important about the fact that the Pan-American Highway, a road system that stretches across more than 30,000 kilometres, that crosses mountain ranges and deserts and rivers and rainforests, that connects Prudhoe Bay in Alaska to Ushuaia at the southern tip of Argentina, simply stops. It does not taper off. It does not become a dirt track. It ends. And then, after 106 kilometres of forest and swamp and river and mud, it begins again. And the world on the other side continues as if nothing interrupted it. There is no other place quite like this on the map. Not in the way the Darién is. Other gaps in road networks exist because of geography that was never intended to be crossed. Remote ocean stretches, high mountain passes closed for half the year, uninhabited ice fields. The Darién is different because it was supposed to be crossed. The road was planned, the surveys were done, the money was discussed. Committees met, reports were written, and then the jungle looked back at all of it, and the jungle did not blink. What the Darién Gap tells us, if we are willing to listen to it carefully, is not that human ambition is foolish. The engineers who surveyed those 3 possible routes in the early 1970s were not foolish. The people who built the rest of the Pan-American Highway were not foolish. What the Gap tells us is something a little more uncomfortable than that. It tells us that there are still places in the world that operate according to their own logic, and that human logic, even very sophisticated, very well funded, very carefully applied human logic, is not always the stronger argument. We're not used to hearing that, especially not in the context of infrastructure. Roads get built through mountains, tunnels get bored under oceans, bridges span distances that would have seemed impossible a century ago. The general direction of the last 200 years of human engineering has been toward the conclusion that geography is a problem to be solved, and that given enough time and money and political will, it can be solved. The Darién has been quietly, stubbornly, comprehensively refusing that conclusion for as long as anyone has been trying to apply it. And what is interesting, what is genuinely interesting, not just as a curiosity, but as something worth thinking about, is that the gap has persisted not because of any single overwhelming obstacle. The terrain is difficult, but terrain has been overcome before. The cost is high, but high costs have been funded before. The ecological concerns are serious, but ecological concerns have been weighed against development before. The security situation is dangerous, but dangerous regions have seen infrastructure built before. What makes the Darién different is that all of these things are true at the same time, and they reinforce each other in a way that makes the whole problem larger than the sum of its parts. You cannot solve the engineering without solving the security. You cannot solve the security without solving the political will. You cannot build the political will without resolving the ecological questions, and you cannot resolve the ecological questions without answering what the road is actually for and who it actually serves, and whether the answer to both of those questions is honest. That last part is the one that tends to get avoided in polite conversation about the gap, the question of who the road would serve, because the answer, if you follow the logic of the original Pan-American Highway project, is not primarily the Embera villages along the Tuira River. It is not the Guna communities on the coast. It is not the migrants walking through the forest right now, though a road would certainly change their situation. Whether for better or worse is genuinely unclear, and the people who study this do not agree. The road, as originally conceived, was about continental connectivity, about commerce, about the symbolic completion of a project that was always as much about a certain idea of progress as it was about actual transportation needs. And that idea of progress, the idea that connectivity is inherently good, that linking places together always produces more benefit than cost, that the natural world is most valuable when it is made accessible, is an idea that has been doing a lot of quiet rethinking over the last several decades. Not universally, not without pushback, but genuinely. In the places where these decisions get made, there is more hesitation now than there was in 1960. More awareness that what gets lost when a road goes through a place like the Darién is not nothing. That the foot-and-mouth barrier is real, and the consequences of losing it are real. That the jaguar population in the Darién is one of the last viable ones in Central America. That the harpy eagle nests in trees that have been standing longer than any road project has been planned. That the forest itself, in its dense, wet, indifferent complexity, is doing things for the climate and the watershed and the regional ecology that no road will ever do. None of this means the people crossing the Darién on foot right now should be crossing it on foot. That is a separate question, and it is a genuinely painful one. The 520,000 people who walked through this forest in 2023 were not walking through it because they wanted a nature experience. They were walking through it because it was the only path available to them, and because whatever they were walking toward felt more survivable than whatever they were walking away from. They deserve better options. They deserve safe passage, medical support, legal pathways, and the kind of international attention that matches the scale of what is happening. The fact that the Darién is difficult does not make their suffering acceptable. It just makes it harder to see and harder to address. And there are people living in the gap. People who have been living there for generations, who deserve to have their lives taken seriously in a way that they largely have not been. The Embera and Wunan communities along the rivers, the Guna on the coast, the smaller settlements that do not appear on most maps. These are not background characters in a story about a road. They are the people for whom the Darién is home, in the fullest sense of that word. They know its rhythms and its dangers and its seasons in a way that no survey team or engineering report has ever fully captured. And the decisions being made about the region's future in Panama City, in Bogota, in Washington, in the offices of the Inter-American Development Bank, are being made largely without them at the centre of the conversation. That is not new. It has been true since Balboa pushed through in 1513 with Indigenous guides he did not particularly choose to credit. It has been true through every survey and every feasibility study and every committee meeting since. The people who know the Darién best have rarely been the people with the most power to shape what happens to it. That is one of the oldest and most persistent stories in the history of places like this, and the Darién is not an exception to it. What the Gap does, in its quiet, unhurried way, is hold all of these things together in one place. The colonial history and the engineering ambition and the ecological reality, and the humanitarian crisis, and the indigenous knowledge, and the criminal networks and the political calculations. All of it is present in those 106 kilometres of forest and river and mud. The Darién is not a simple place that has been made complicated by outside attention. It was always complicated. The outside attention has just made more people aware of how complicated it is. There is something almost consoling about a place that resists simplification this thoroughly. Not consoling in a way that ignores the suffering happening inside it. That suffering is real, and it matters, and it should not be romanticised. But consoling in the sense that the world still contains places that do not yield to a single explanation, that cannot be fully captured by any one frame, that continue to be more than any description of them manages to convey. The Darién is one of those places. It has been one of those places for a very long time, somewhere in the forest tonight, and it is night somewhere in the Darién right now, the kind of deep, wet, insect-loud night that the forest produces without effort. There are people walking. They have been walking for days. They're tired in a way that is difficult to describe from the outside. They're thinking about the other side of the forest, about what comes after, about the people they left behind and the people they are trying to reach. They are not thinking about the Pan-American Highway or the 1971 feasibility study or the UNESCO designation. They are thinking about the next river crossing, and whether the water has risen since the last person through, and whether their boots will last another day. And somewhere else in the same forest, a harpy eagle is sitting in a tree that is older than any road. A feu de lance is moving through the leaf litter without any awareness that anything unusual is happening in its territory. A jaguar, one of the last viable jaguar populations in Central America, is doing whatever jaguars do in the deep part of the night. The forest does not distinguish between the drama of human history and the ordinary business of being a forest. It has been doing this longer than any of us have been paying attention, and it will likely be doing it long after the last committee report has been written and filed and forgotten. That is not a pessimistic thought, or at least it does not have to be. There is something worth holding on to in the idea that the world still contains a place where the most powerful road-building civilization in history looked at 106 kilometres of jungle and, for once, did not get what it wanted. Where the accumulated weight of geography and ecology and politics and human stubbornness and sheer physical reality said, not here. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The Pan-American Highway will continue to sit at the jungle's edge, patient and certain of itself the way roads are, and the Darién will continue to be what it has always been. Difficult, layered, dangerous, alive, and entirely unimpressed by the road waiting at its border. Thank you for spending this time here tonight. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about maps differently, or about what we mean when we say a place is impossible, it would mean a great deal if you left a like or shared this with someone who might find it worth listening to. And if you are not yet subscribed to Life Beyond Seen, this is a gentle invitation to do that. There are many more stories like this one waiting, and the channel is a quiet place to find them. Rest well wherever you are.